turning them into cascading sheets of distorted glass that made the streetlights outside pulse and waver like dying stars. I sat in the monitoring room on the ground floor, surrounded by flickering screens that showed empty hallways and abandoned offices. The prefettura had hired me to watch over the place, while contractors cataloged decades of legal archives, preparing the building for its transformation into a municipal museum. Budget cuts meant I worked alone on the night shift, which suited me fine. Less people meant less conversation, and I'd never been good at small talk. The building itself was a relic from the 1920s, all Art Deco flourishes and marble columns that had weathered into something between elegance and decay. During the day, the place felt almost noble, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows and illuminating the brass fixtures that still gleamed in places. But at night, it became something else, something that breathed differently, settled into itself with creaks and groans that sounded almost deliberate. My instructions had been simple. Make rounds every hour, check the locks, monitor the cameras, and never, under any circumstances, go down to the basement archive after midnight. The site supervisor had been emphatic about that last part, his weathered face serious as he handed me the keys on my first night. The elevator gets wonky after 12, he'd said, not meeting my eyes. Old wiring, probably. Sometimes it moves on its own. Just leave it alone until morning. I hadn't asked why the cameras didn't cover the basement, hadn't questioned why the blueprints showed only 2 sub-levels, when the elevator panel had buttons for 3. Jobs like this paid enough that you learned not to ask questions that might complicate the arrangement. At 11:59, I stood to make my midnight round, the rain outside building to a roar that swallowed the usual settling sounds of the old building. The monitoring room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in as the minute hand clicked over to 12. I grabbed my flashlight from the desk. The overhead lights had a tendency to flicker and die in some corridors, and stepped into the main hallway. The courthouse at night was a museum of shadows. My footsteps echoed off the marble floors, multiplying until it sounded like a dozen people walking in unsynchronized rhythm. The air held that particular stillness of old public buildings, thick with the accumulated weight of decades of human drama. All those trials and verdicts and lives changed within these walls. Sometimes I wondered if buildings absorbed something from the people who passed through them, if they held memories in their bones the way people did. I was passing the old courtroom on the 2nd floor when the elevator chimed. The sound cut through the rain like a bell at a funeral, clear and bright and wrong. I froze, listening. The elevator was at the far end of the building, near the east stairwell. I hadn't called it. Nobody else was supposed to be here. Another chime. Then the distinctive mechanical hum of the car descending. My pulse kicked up, flooding my mouth with the copper taste of adrenaline. Squeezing the flashlight until my knuckles ached, I moved toward the east wing. My footsteps suddenly too loud, too obvious. The elevator shaft was enclosed in decorative brass gates, the kind of old-fashioned setup where you could see the car moving through the metalwork. Through the gaps, I watched the illuminated box slide past, heading down. Down past the ground floor, down to the basement. The hum stopped silence, except for the rain. Then the elevator began to rise again. I watched it climb, fighting the urge to step away from the shaft, to put distance between myself and whatever might emerge when those doors opened. But the car passed the ground floor, continued to the 2nd where I stood, then kept rising to the 3rd. At the top, it paused, chimed, then began its descent again, down past 3, down past 2, past 1, into the basement. This time, when it started to rise, I was already moving back to the monitoring room, my breath coming quick and shallow. This was just a malfunction, exactly what the supervisor had warned me about. Old wiring, a short circuit, nothing that required my intervention until morning. But as I settled back in front of the screens, pulling up the camera feeds with shaking hands, I found myself cycling through the views, checking every angle, empty offices, vacant hallways, the loading dock with its roll-down doors sealed tight, the main entrance, rain streaming down the glass. Everything was secure. Everything was normal. I reached for the feed that showed the elevator lobby on the ground floor. The car was there, doors closed, indicator light dark. But even as I watched, the light blinked on. The doors opened. Nobody emerged. The doors closed again. The light moved down. B1, B2. Then stopped at a level that shouldn't exist. A symbol that looked like a zero crossed with a horizontal line. Something I'd never seen on the panel during my daytime training. My hands moved without conscious thought, cycling through every camera feed, searching for one that might show the basement levels. But there were no basement feeds, just static on channels 7 through 9, white noise that seemed to pulse with something almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. The elevator was rising again. I should have ignored it. Should have stayed in my chair, filled out my hourly report, and pretended the old building was just settling into its nightly routine. Instead, I found myself pulling up the ground floor corridor cameras, watching the elevator lobby from 3 different angles. The car arrived, chimed. Door slid open. This time, something moved inside. My vision tunneled, the edges of the screens going dark as I leaned forward, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A figure stood in the elevator, silhouetted against the dim interior light. Dark uniform, broad shoulders, one arm hanging at its side, the other raised, holding something that caught the light. A flashlight maybe, or... The figure stepped out of the elevator, moving with the careful, measured pace of someone making their rounds. It walked down the corridor, past the old courtroom doors, toward the West Wing, toward the offices I'd just checked 15 minutes ago. The camera angle wasn't sharp enough to make out details, just the shape, the posture, the rhythm of the walk that seemed oddly familiar, in a way that made my scalp prickle with gooseflesh. I cycled through cameras, following the figure's progress. 2nd floor, 3rd floor corridor, past the water-damaged ceiling tiles and the stack of boxes waiting to be cataloged. When the figure passed under the good camera, the one installed just last week near the administrative offices, I saw it clearly. I saw myself. Same uniform, same build, same way of holding the flashlight low and to the side, a habit I'd picked up years ago to keep the beam from blinding me in reflective surfaces. The figure on the screen was walking my route, checking my doors, moving through the building with the exact cadence and rhythm of my own rounds. But I was sitting in the monitoring room. I could feel the chair beneath me, the keyboard under my fingers, the rapid-fire thump of my heart against my ribs. The figure on the screen reached the end of the corridor, paused at the window that overlooked the street, then turned back, moving toward the camera, moving toward the monitoring room. I spun in my chair, facing the door, the flashlight suddenly a weapon in my white-knuckled grip. The corridor outside was dark, the motion sensor lights inactive. Nothing moving. Nothing there. When I looked back at the screens, the figure was gone. I cycled through every feed, fingers clumsy on the controls, but the corridors were empty again. Just shadows and rain-streaked windows, and the same furniture I'd been cataloging for 2 weeks. Everything was where it should be, except the elevator was moving again. Down, down, down to that impossible level. My shift ended at 6. I could stay in this room, doors locked, and wait for sunrise. But the monitoring logs would show I hadn't made my rounds, and I needed this job. Needed the money too much to risk losing it over some malfunction and my own jumpiness. The rational explanations lined up in my mind like evidence in a trial. Old camera systems could glitch, creating artifacts that looked like human figures. The elevator was old, probably just responding to electrical surges during the storm. The basement level indicator was damaged, showing corrupted symbols instead of proper floor numbers. Everything had a logical explanation. I stood, testing my legs, making sure they would hold. The flashlight felt inadequate, a joke of a defense against whatever might be waiting in those corridors. But I'd done 2 tours overseas before this job, had spent months in places where every shadow might hide a threat, and I'd learned that the anticipation was always worse than the reality. The hallway outside the monitoring room was exactly as I'd left it. Same scuffed marble. Same water stain shaped like a continent on the ceiling. The motion lights flickered on as I moved, casting my shadow long and thin against the walls. I checked the offices, the bathrooms, the storage closets, all empty, all secure. At the elevator lobby I stopped. The brass gates were closed, the car resting on the ground floor. Through the decorative metalwork, I could see the interior was empty, the old wooden bench undisturbed. The button panel showed only the normal floors. B2, B1, 1, 2, 3. No mysterious symbol. No impossible level. I reached out, hesitated, then pressed the call button. The car descended immediately, as if it had been waiting. When the doors opened, the interior looked exactly as it always did. Worn wood paneling, that faint smell of brass polish and old paper, the bench where previous generations of clerks and lawyers had sat, probably discussing cases that were now just file numbers in boxes waiting to be cataloged. I stepped inside, my finger hovering over the B1 button. Just a quick check of the archive entrance. Confirm it was still locked, then back upstairs to finish my shift. The button felt warm under my fingertip, almost pulsing with a heat that shouldn't be there. I pressed it anyway. The elevator lurched, then began its descent with a grinding sound that raised every hair on my arms. Through the brass gates, I watched the floors slide past. Ground level. The walls became rougher brick as we entered the basement levels. B1 passed, then B2. The elevator didn't stop. I jabbed at the B2 button, the ground floor button, anything to halt the descent. But the car kept moving, that grinding sound getting louder, more insistent. The indicator light flickered, cycling through the floor numbers, then settled on that crossed zero symbol I'd seen on the monitors. The car jerked to a stop. The doors didn't open. Through the gates, I could see a corridor I'd never seen in any blueprint or orientation. The walls were the same brick as the upper basement levels, but older somehow, the mortar crumbling in places. The lights were different too. Not the modern LED strips installed throughout the rest of the building, but old fixtures that cast a yellow, sickly glow that seemed to move and breathe. The elevator doors remained closed, and I realized with a sick twist of relief that I wasn't going to have to step out into that hallway. Wasn't going to have to investigate whatever existed down here. I pressed the ground floor button again, harder this time, and the elevator shuddered but didn't move. That's when I saw the figure. It stood at the far end of the corridor, facing away from me, shoulders hunched in a posture that radiated something between exhaustion and despair. Same uniform, same build. As I watched, frozen and unable to look away, it began to walk, moving deeper into the basement, away from the elevator. Its footsteps echoed, creating that same multiplication effect I'd heard in the upstairs hallways. But down here it sounded different, more deliberate, more purposeful, like each step was being recorded and replayed over and over. The figure reached a door I hadn't noticed before, one that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It didn't hesitate, didn't reach for a handle, just walked through the door as if it weren't there at all. The elevator jolted upward so suddenly I stumbled, catching myself against the wooden bench. The crossed zero symbol flickered, then died, replaced by the normal floor indicators, B2, B1, ground floor. The doors opened, and I burst out into the lobby, gasping for air I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My legs felt liquid, barely supporting my weight as I staggered back to the monitoring room and locked the door behind me. On the screens, the building was empty. Normal. The elevator sat idle on the ground floor, exactly where I'd left it. But Channel 9, one of the supposed dead feeds that should show nothing but static, was displaying an image now. It showed the monitoring room, my monitoring room. I could see the desk, the chair, the same coffee cup I'd left there hours ago, the same keyboard, the same orientation. But the chair was occupied. Someone was sitting in my seat, their back to the camera, watching the bank of monitors in front of them. As I stared at the screen, my screen, the figure in the monitoring room turned around. I couldn't make out the features clearly. The resolution was too poor, the angle too distant, but I could see enough. The uniform, the posture, the way the figure held itself, tense and alert, exactly the way I was sitting at that very moment. The figure on Channel 9 was watching their own screens, and on one of those screens, I could just barely make it out, was another monitoring room, another figure in a chair, another set of screens displaying the same scene at one remove. How many times did it repeat? How many levels down did it go? I reached for the keyboard, intending to change the channel, to cycle through the feeds until I found something solid and real and normal. But my hand passed through the keyboard like it wasn't there at all. And I realized with a clarity that felt like falling that I couldn't remember leaving the elevator, couldn't remember walking back to the monitoring room, couldn't remember if I'd ever really been sitting here at all, or if I'd been standing in a basement corridor, watching an elevator I couldn't reach, waiting for a shift that would never end. The rain continued outside, hammering against windows I might not have the right to see through anymore. The elevator chimed somewhere in the building, beginning its circuit again, down to the basement, up to the floors above, carrying its passenger through rounds that might never end, watching monitors that showed nothing but reflections of reflections, each one a little more distant, a little less real. At 11:47 tomorrow night, someone else might sit in this chair, watching these screens, counting down the minutes until midnight. They might see me on the cameras, walking the corridors, checking the doors, moving through the building with the mechanical precision of someone who's forgotten they're not supposed to be there anymore. Or maybe they'll be smart. Maybe they'll follow the instructions. Maybe they'll never go down to the basement after midnight, never press that button, never see that crossed zero symbol that marks a place where floors and shifts and entire lives can repeat forever, trapped in the architecture of an old building that remembers everything and everyone who ever walked its halls. The clock on the wall shows 11:58, almost time for my midnight round. I stand, grab my flashlight from the desk and step into the hallway. The rain is starting outside, heavy drops hammering against the tall windows. The elevator is waiting. It's always waiting. And somewhere below me, in a basement that might not exist on any blueprint, someone who looks exactly like me is watching monitors that show a monitoring room where someone else is preparing for rounds they've made 1,000 times before, each one identical to the last, each one real in its own way, each one just another layer in a building that's learned to fold itself into impossible spaces. The elevator chimes. I walk toward it, because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. That's what I'll keep doing, every night at midnight, for as long as the courthouse needs a security guard to watch over its secrets. The doors open. The interior is empty, waiting. I step inside. The doors close behind me, and I reach for the button, but my finger hovers, uncertain whether to press B1 or that crossed zero symbol that keeps appearing when I'm not looking directly at it. Down below, in some version of this basement, another me is making the same decision, reaching for the same button, trapped in the same moment of choice that might have already been decided 1,000 shifts ago. The elevator begins to move on its own, down, always down, and the rain keeps falling outside, washing away any evidence that tonight was ever different from any other night, that this shift will ever end, that I was ever anything more than a shadow caught in the machinery of a building that catalogs everything, including the people who think they're just passing through. Story 2. The invitation came on a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what it would become. My friend Diego mentioned the old industrial complex during our lunch break, his voice carrying that particular enthusiasm reserved for urban explorers and the willfully reckless. The place had been abandoned for 15 years, he said, sitting behind active train lines and a newly developed neighborhood that pretended it didn't exist. I should have said no. The air tasted different as we approached, metallic, dense with something I couldn't name. Diego led the way across the vacant lot, his flashlight cutting shallow arcs through the October darkness behind us. The residential development stood like a row of illuminated teeth, windows glowing warmly against the night. Ahead, the industrial complex rose from the earth like something that had been deliberately forgotten, its silhouette jagged and wrong against the sky. "You ever wonder why they never tore this place down?" Diego asked, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I hadn't, but now the question burrowed into my thoughts. The complex was prime real estate, close enough to the city center that developers should have been salivating over it. Yet here it stood, untouched, as if some unspoken agreement had been reached to let it rot in peace. The ground beneath our feet changed texture as we walked, from packed earth to broken asphalt to something that felt almost organic in its decay. I glanced back at the houses, seeking reassurance in their ordinary domesticity. The lights in the nearest windows flickered, then went dark. I stopped, my pulse quickening. "Power outage?" I suggested, though my voice carried no conviction. Diego didn't turn around. "They've been having issues with the grid out here, keeps happening." But as I watched, the lights returned, except they seemed to have rearranged themselves somehow, as if the houses had shuffled positions while I wasn't looking. I told myself it was a trick of perspective, the angle of our approach distorting what I saw. I told myself many things that night. Very few of them were true. The main entrance to the complex had been chained shut, but Diego knew another way. A service door on the eastern side that hung perpetually ajar, held open by years of rust and neglect. The metal groaned as we pushed through, a sound that seemed to travel farther than it should have, echoing through chambers we couldn't see. Inside, the darkness had weight. Our flashlights did little to penetrate it, creating instead small islands of visibility that made the surrounding void feel more oppressive. The air was thick with dust and something else, a smell like old copper and rain-soaked concrete. The floor was littered with debris, collapsed ceiling tiles, twisted metal brackets, fragments of machinery whose original purpose had been rendered mysterious by decay. Diego moved with confidence, his beam sweeping across graffitied walls and empty doorways. I followed, trying to match his casual stride, trying not to think about how the entrance had felt behind us as we passed through, like crossing a threshold from which there might be no easy return. "This used to be a packaging facility," Diego said, his voice bouncing oddly in the cavernous space. "They made industrial containers, shipping equipment. Closed down after some kind of accident. Nobody talks about it much." I wanted to ask what kind of accident, but something about the way he'd said it, that careful vagueness, made me think he didn't actually know, or didn't want to. We entered what must have once been the main production floor, a vast cathedral of rust and shadow. Overhead, the ceiling was barely visible, lost in darkness despite our lights. Massive support pillars rose at regular intervals, their surfaces mottled with corrosion and strange staining that looked almost deliberate, almost like patterns. That's when I heard it. A metallic sound, sharp and clear, coming from somewhere deep in the building. Not the settling creak of old architecture, but something purposeful, like steel sliding against steel, or chains being drawn across concrete. "You hear that?" I whispered, though I don't know why I lowered my voice. Diego had frozen mid-step, his flashlight steady on a distant wall. "Yeah." We stood in silence, listening. The sound came again, this time from a different direction, or perhaps the acoustics of the space were simply too warped to trust. It was followed by something else, a rhythmic scraping, like fingernails on metal, patient and persistent. "There's no one here," Diego said, but he didn't sound convinced. Probably just wind moving stuff around. Except there was no wind. The air inside the complex was perfectly still, as if the building itself was holding its breath. We pressed on, though some instinct was already screaming at me to turn back. The production floor gave way to a series of smaller rooms, offices perhaps, or storage areas. Here the decay was more intimate, more personal. Papers still sat on desks, their contents long since faded to illegibility. A coffee mug rested on a filing cabinet, its interior stained black. A jacket hung from a hook, its fabric so deteriorated it seemed to be dissolving into the air. And then I saw the marks. They covered the walls of one narrow corridor, concentrated around a sealed doorway. Handprints, smeared and overlapping, as if someone had pressed their palms against the surface repeatedly, desperately. But it wasn't the quantity that made my skin crawl. It was their freshness. The marks looked recent, the moisture still dark against the pale paint, glistening slightly in our flashlight beams. "Diego," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. He'd seen them too. His light traced the patterns, moving up and down, revealing more details I wished I hadn't noticed. The handprints weren't just pressed against the wall. They were clawing, fingers splayed and desperate. And lower down, near the floor, were scratches, deep gouges in the concrete, arranged in sets of 5, dragging toward the sealed door as if something had been trying to escape, or trying to get in. "These are old," Diego said, but his voice shook. "Has to be. Some kind of staining, or—" I touched one of the handprints. My finger came away damp. The scraping sound returned, louder now, unmistakably close. It came from behind the sealed door, regular and rhythmic, like something methodically working its way through metal. We stumbled backward, our lights dancing wildly across the corridor walls, revealing more handprints, more scratches, spreading like an infection across every surface. "We should go," I said. Diego nodded, already turning. Yeah, we should definitely go." But the building had different ideas. The corridor that should have led us back to the production floor instead opened into a space I didn't recognize. The walls were closer together, the ceiling lower, pressing down with claustrophobic intensity. Our footsteps echoed wrong, each impact seeming to arrive a fraction of a second out of sync with the actual step. "This isn't right," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "We didn't come through here." Diego swept his light across the walls, searching for landmarks, for any familiar detail. Must have taken a wrong turn. It's easy to get turned around in places like this. But we hadn't turned. I was certain of it. We'd retraced our steps exactly, following our own footprints in the dust. Yet here we were, in a space that shouldn't exist, walking through geometry that refused to make sense. The metallic sounds were everywhere now, surrounding us, coming from above and below and inside the walls. I could feel vibrations through the floor, rhythmic and purposeful, like the building itself had developed a heartbeat. And beneath it all, barely audible, was something else. A sound that might have been breathing, or wind through broken pipes, or voices speaking in frequencies just below comprehension. We walked faster, then jogged, then ran, our flashlights creating stuttering motion picture images of endless corridors and identical rooms. Doorways appeared and disappeared, opening onto spaces that couldn't possibly fit within the building's exterior dimensions. The handprints were everywhere now, covering every surface, fresh and glistening, arranged in patterns that suggested intention, intelligence, purpose. I glanced at Diego, and in the wild swing of light I saw his face, pale, sweat-beaded, eyes too wide. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite name, a distance in his expression, as if he were looking at something I couldn't see, listening to something I couldn't hear. "Diego," I said, grabbing his arm. "Diego, look at me." He did, and for a moment his eyes focused, seeing me again. But in that moment I saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or realization, like he'd remembered something he'd been trying to forget. "I've been here before," he whispered. The words hung between us, heavy with implications I didn't want to examine. Before I could respond, we rounded a corner and found ourselves facing the service door, the same rusted entrance we'd used to enter the building. Relief flooded through me, so intense it was almost painful. "Thank God," I breathed, moving toward the exit. But Diego didn't follow. He stood motionless, his flashlight pointed at the door, his face slack with an emotion I couldn't identify. Fear, maybe, or something worse. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I already felt the wrongness settling over me like a physical weight. "Look at it," he said softly. I looked. The door was the same rust, same angle of opening, same darkness beyond, exactly the same. Too exactly. Every detail was identical to how it had been when we entered, down to the specific pattern of corrosion on the hinges, the precise angle of the gap. "So," I said, desperate to leave, to be anywhere but here. "Look at it," Diego repeated, his voice hollow. And then I understood. The door was identical because it was the same moment, the same slice of time, preserved and repeating. We hadn't found our way back to the exit. We'd found a memory of the exit, or a copy, or something worse. I pushed through anyway, unable to stop myself, needing to feel open air and see the sky. The door swung outward with that same groaning sound, and I stumbled through, expecting to see the vacant lot and the residential development and the normal world waiting patiently for our return. The darkness was absolute. No stars, no moon, no lights from the houses that should have been visible in the distance. Just void, extending in all directions, so complete it seemed to swallow our flashlight beams before they could travel more than a few feet. The ground beneath my feet felt the same, packed earth and broken asphalt. But when I looked down, I couldn't see it, couldn't see anything below my knees. Where? I started, but the darkness seemed to absorb my words, flattening them, rendering them meaningless. Diego emerged beside me, his flashlight adding nothing to the void. We stood together at the threshold, neither in nor out, suspended in a space that refused to be either building or world. "The city," I said, turning in a slow circle, searching for any hint of light, any sign of civilization. "Where's the city?" It should have been visible from here, a vast glow on the horizon, light pollution painting the sky orange and gray. We were only 3 miles from downtown, close enough that you could never truly escape its presence. But the horizon was gone. There was no up or down, no distance or depth, just darkness and the two of us and the doorway behind us, leading back into a building that had somehow become the only solid thing in existence. I pulled out my phone, desperate for its familiar glow, for the reassurance of its connection to the outside world. The screen lit up, casting harsh blue light across my hands, my arms, the ground at my feet. No signal, no GPS. The time displayed was wrong, flickering between different hours, different dates, as if the device couldn't decide when we were. "We need to go back in," Diego said. His voice was steady now, resigned. "Find another way out." Back in? The suggestion felt insane, suicidal. The building was the problem, the source of whatever was happening. Going back inside was like walking into a predator's mouth. But what choice did we have? Stand here in the void until we simply ceased to exist? I looked at Diego, trying to read his expression in the dim light, trying to understand how he could be so calm. And that's when I noticed his hands. They were covered in marks. Dark smudges across his palms, his fingers, as if he'd been touching something wet and staining. The same marks I'd seen on the walls. Fresh marks. "Diego," I said slowly, "when did you touch the handprints?" He looked down at his hands, his expression distant, almost dreamy. I didn't. But the marks were there, unmistakable. And as I stared, I realized they were spreading, creeping up his wrists, darkening, multiplying. He didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. "How many times have you been here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the doorway, his flashlight illuminating the threshold. And in that light, I saw what I hadn't noticed before. More handprints on the doorframe, on the walls just inside. Some old and faded, some fresh, and some that looked exactly like the marks on Diego's hands. "I don't know," he said finally. "I can't remember, but I think..." He paused, his throat working. "I think I've always been here. Or maybe I never left. Maybe none of us do." I don't know how long we stood there. Time had become unreliable, stretching and compressing, minutes feeling like hours and hours passing in seconds. Eventually, without discussion, we moved back through the doorway, re-entering the building because it was the only direction that seemed to exist. The interior had changed again. Or perhaps it had always been this way. And my memory was the thing that had changed. The corridors were narrower now, the ceiling so low I had to duck my head. The walls were closer, pressing in, and they were covered, every inch, every surface, with handprints and scratches and marks I didn't have names for. We walked in silence, following a path that seemed to choose itself. The metallic sounds had stopped, replaced by something worse. A profound quiet that felt like anticipation, like the building was waiting for something to happen. or waiting for us to understand something we'd been refusing to see. Diego walked ahead of me, his movements increasingly mechanical, as if he were following a script written long ago. The marks on his hands had spread to his forearms now, creeping up toward his elbows, dark and glistening. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. "Do you remember inviting me here?" I asked suddenly, the question emerging from some deep instinct. He kept walking. "Of course." "Why?" "Because you needed to come." The answer made no sense, but also made perfect sense. I tried to remember our lunch conversation, the moment he'd suggested this trip, but the memory was slippery, refusing to solidify. Had he really invited me? Or had I suggested it? Or had neither of us said anything at all, but simply understood that this was where we needed to be? We emerged into another vast space, perhaps the same production floor, perhaps something else entirely. My flashlight beam swept across the darkness, catching glimpses of pillars, machinery, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. And in the center of the space, barely visible, was something that might have been a figure, or might have been nothing at all, standing perfectly still, waiting. Diego walked toward it. "Don't," I said, my voice cracking. "Diego, don't." But he kept walking, his footsteps echoing, each impact seeming to resonate in my chest. The marks had reached his shoulders now, spreading across his neck, beginning to creep up toward his face. And as I watched, I understood that they weren't stains at all. They were transformations, integrations, the building slowly claiming him, making him part of its structure, its history, its endless present. I should have run. Should have turned and fled and found another exit. Any exit, even if it meant stepping back into that absolute void. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, and when I looked down, I saw why. My own hands were marked. The same dark smudges, the same spreading stains. How long had they been there? Had I touched something? Or had the building simply decided it was time? Diego reached the center of the space and stopped. He turned to face me, and in the crossfire of our flashlights, I saw his face. The marks had reached his cheeks, his forehead surrounding his eyes, but his expression was peaceful, almost serene. "It's not so bad," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "Being remembered, being part of something, better than disappearing completely." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came, because I understood, suddenly and completely, what this place was. Not a building, but a repository. Not abandoned, but inhabited. Every handprint was a person, every mark a memory, every scratch a desperate attempt to be remembered, to leave some trace of existence behind. The city lights hadn't disappeared. They'd never been there at all. We'd crossed a threshold the moment we entered, stepping out of the normal world into this space between, this pocket of accumulated forgetting where the discarded and dismissed collected like sediment. And we were adding to it. Our presence here, our fear, our desperate clinging to identity. All of it was being absorbed, recorded, pressed into the walls like fossils in stone. I don't know if I'm still in the building or if I ever left. Sometimes I think I'm sitting at my desk at work, and this is all a memory, a dream from which I woke screaming. Sometimes I'm certain I'm still walking those corridors, following Diego's diminishing figure deeper into the complex, my own mark spreading, my own self slowly integrating into the architecture of forgetting. What I know is this: I can't go back to that neighborhood anymore. Can't drive past without feeling a pull, a recognition, like the building is calling to me, reminding me that I left something behind, or that something of me is still there, pressed into the walls, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I look at my hands in the bathroom mirror, and I'm certain I see marks beginning to form. Dark smudges across my palms spreading slowly. Inevitably, I wash them obsessively, scrubbing until my skin is raw, but they always seem to return. Or maybe they never left. Or maybe they were always there and I'm only now learning to see them. Diego never came back to work. His apartment was found empty, his things still in place but covered in dust, as if he'd been gone for years rather than days. The police investigated briefly, but there were no leads, no evidence of foul play. He simply stopped existing in any meaningful way, becoming one more person who wandered into the margins and never found their way back. I think about telling someone, about warning them. But what would I say? That there's a building that exists in the space between existence and non-existence, collecting the forgotten and the forgetting. That we live our lives on the edge of a threshold we can't see, and crossing it is as simple as walking through the wrong doorway on the wrong night. They'd think I was insane. Maybe I am. Maybe that's the final trick. The building doesn't need to keep us. It just needs to make us doubt ourselves enough that we can't trust our own memories, our own perceptions. It needs us to carry it with us, internalized and inescapable. The marks are spreading. I can feel them now, even when I can't see them. A coldness in my skin, a sensation of being slowly erased, overwritten. Sometimes I wake up in the night and I'm not sure where I am. My bedroom or one of those endless corridors. My bed or some pile of debris in a forgotten room. And the worst part is that I'm starting to feel what Diego felt. That acceptance, that peace. Because being part of something, even something horrible, is better than being nothing at all. Better than disappearing without a trace, without anyone to remember or care. I've started driving past the neighborhood again. Just to look, just to remember. The houses are still there, lights glowing warmly, families moving behind curtains. But I can see what lies beyond them now. That darkness, that absolute void. And I know that someday soon, I'll park my car and walk across that vacant lot and push through that rusted service door. Not because I have to, but because part of me is still there, has always been there, will always be there. Pressed into the walls, waiting to be completed, waiting to finally understand what I couldn't understand that night. What threshold we'd actually crossed. And whether we'd crossed it entering the building, or leaving it, or if maybe we'd never been outside it at all. The marks are on my face now. I can see them in the mirror when the light hits just right. And I remember, or think I remember, that Diego's last words to me weren't about being remembered. They were about something else, something I've been trying not to think about. He said, "You can't leave until you understand. None of us can." And I'm starting to see the truth that the building has been trying to show me all along. That we're not trapped by walls or corridors or sealed doorways. We're trapped by the simple, terrible fact that we were never meant to leave. That the invitation wasn't Diego's at all. That something inside that complex had called to us, recognized us, identified us as belonging to it in some fundamental way. And once something claims you like that, once you've been marked and recorded and integrated into its memory, there's no going back. There's only the slow, inevitable process of becoming part of the architecture, of being pressed, layer by layer, into the walls where you'll wait, and watch, and add your handprints to all the others. I think I'm ready now. Ready to go back. Ready to stop fighting what I've always known. The threshold is calling. And this time, I don't think I'll try to leave. After all, the marks are spreading, and the building needs to be fed. Story 3. The amber glow of the gas station sign felt like the last piece of civilization I'd see for hours. I'd been hauling freight across state lines for 15 years, and I knew every major route like the back of my hand. Every truck stop, every diner, every stretch of cracked asphalt where the road seemed to breathe with the heat. But tonight was different. Tonight, I was tired in a way that went deeper than muscle and bone. The other driver had approached me while I was filling up. A wiry man with sun-damaged skin and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He'd mentioned the shortcut almost casually, like he was doing me a favor. An old state highway, he said, cut through the backwoods and would save me nearly 2 hours. No traffic, no way stations, just straight road. He'd drawn a crude map on a napkin with a ballpoint pen, his fingers stained with grease and tobacco. I should have questioned why a route that good wasn't already packed with trucks. I should have noticed the way his smile didn't quite reach those distant eyes. But exhaustion makes you stupid, makes you willing to believe in shortcuts that seem too good to be true. The turnoff appeared exactly where he'd marked it, a crumbling exit ramp that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The sign was so weathered I could barely make out the route number. As my rig rolled onto the road, the highway lights disappeared behind me, swallowed by the thick darkness that pressed against my windshield like something physical. The road itself was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 lanes, with weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement. Tall grass lined both sides, swaying in a wind I couldn't hear through the cab. The few streetlights that remained stood at irregular intervals, casting pools of sickly yellow light that seemed to make the shadows between them even darker. My headlights carved a tunnel through the blackness, revealing nothing but more road, more grass, more night. I glanced at the GPS mounted on my dashboard. The screen flickered, then displayed a message I'd never seen before. Route not found. I tried resetting it, but the message persisted. Fine, I'd driven without GPS before. The napkin speed from 60 to 50, then 40. The lights maintained their distance. I pressed the gas, pushing up to 70. Still the same gap. It was impossible. No driver could match speed so precisely, not without actively trying. And why would anyone try? The grass on either side of the road seemed to grow taller as I drove, leaning inward as if curious about my passage. In the brief illumination of each street light, I caught glimpses of twisted fence posts and rusted signs too faded to read. The whole landscape had the feeling of something abandoned, left to rot and be forgotten. But the road itself remained smooth beneath my tires, the yellow line down the center still faintly visible. Someone had maintained this highway once. Maybe they still did. A green sign emerged from the darkness ahead. Millbrook, 47 miles. That was my destination, the small distribution center where I'd dropped this load 47 miles. I'd covered at least 20 since the turnoff. The math felt wrong, but I was too tired to work it out clearly. The caffeine from my last coffee had worn off, leaving me in that dangerous zone where your eyes want to close, but your brain knows you need to stay alert. The radio static shifted, developed a rhythm. I reached to turn it off, but my hand froze halfway to the dial. Within the white noise, I could hear something, not music, not a voice exactly, more like whispering, barely audible beneath the hiss and crackle. My name seemed to surface from the static, then sink back into it. I killed the power. The radio went silent, the little green light on the display winking out. But the whispering continued, so faint I couldn't be sure I was really hearing it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. From the vents, from the doors, from the darkness outside. My name, repeated over and over in a tone that could have been pleading or threatening or something else entirely. The headlights behind me remained constant, unchanging. I grabbed my CB radio, clicking it on. "Hey, driver behind me, you there?" Static answered, "This is southbound on the old state highway. Anyone copy?" More static, but different than before. Thicker, almost liquid sounding. I hung up the handset with more force than necessary. Another sign appeared. Millbrook, 52 miles. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread it in my fatigue. But no, the numbers were clear. 52 miles. 5 more than the last sign. That was wrong. That was impossible. I'd been driving forward, maintaining speed. The distance should have decreased, not increased. I checked my speedometer, steady at 60 miles per hour. The odometer continued its forward march, confirming I was covering ground. But somehow, my destination was getting farther away. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles going white. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the signs were old, put up wrong. Maybe I'd misremembered the number on the first one. Exhaustion could play tricks on your perception. I'd seen drivers go days without proper sleep, hallucinating entire scenarios that never happened. But I'd slept 6 hours before this run. I wasn't that far gone. The grass on both sides of the road now reached higher than my windows, a dense wall of vegetation that turned each streetlight into an island of visibility in an ocean of darkness. The poles themselves seemed to lean at odd angles, as if the earth beneath them was slowly giving way. In the distance, I thought I saw other lights, pale and blue, drifting through the grass like marsh lights. but when I tried to focus on them, they vanished. I needed to turn around. The thought came clear and sharp through the fog of unease that had been building in my chest. This road was wrong. The signs were wrong. Those lights behind me were wrong. I needed to stop, turn the rig around, and find my way back to the interstate, even if it meant losing hours. But the road remained relentlessly straight, offering no turnoffs, no wide spots, no opportunities to maneuver an 18-wheeler. The grass pressed close on both sides, and I had the irrational fear that if I tried to pull over, my truck would simply sink into that vegetation and never be seen again. The fuel gauge hadn't moved. I'd noticed it peripherally, but only now gave it my full attention. I'd been driving for over an hour since leaving the gas station, but the needle remained precisely where it had been when I started. 3/4 full fuel gauges could stick, especially in older trucks, but mine was new, digital, reliable. Watching it, I saw the needle quiver slightly, as if uncertain where it should be, then settle back to its original position. The engine thrummed beneath me with its usual steady rhythm, a sound I'd grown so accustomed to that I barely heard it anymore. But now I listened, really listened, and heard something else beneath it, a second rhythm, slightly out of sync, like an echo that didn't quite match the original sound. It made my skin prickle with instinctive wrongness. Millbrook, 58 miles. No, I said aloud, my voice strange and small in the cab. No, that's not right. The whispering from the radio grew louder, though the radio itself remained off. My name woven through static that shouldn't exist. Syllables stretched and distorted until they barely resembled words at all. Other sounds joined it, what might have been breathing, or wind, or the rustle of grass against metal. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, each beat a small explosion of panic. The headlights behind me flickered. Just once, a brief interruption in their steady glow, but it sent a jolt of terror through me that was entirely disproportionate to the event. When they came back on, they seemed different somehow, harder, colder, more deliberate in their attention. I couldn't explain how headlights could seem to have intent, but these did. They weren't just following me, they were watching me. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing the speedometer past 70, then 80. The truck shuddered with the strain, not built for this kind of speed on uncertain roads, but those lights maintained their distance with impossible precision. I slammed on the brakes, rubber screaming against asphalt, and the light stopped exactly when I did, as if we were connected by more than just road. The grass on either side swayed in a wind I still couldn't feel, moving in waves that started far ahead and rolled back toward me like something approaching. The streetlights ahead began to flicker in sequence, each one dimming and brightening as I neared it, as if my presence triggered some ancient failing electrical system, or as if something was moving through them, using the lights to track my progress. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some connection to the world I'd left behind. No signal. The screen glowed uselessly in my hand, showing bars that fluctuated between 0 and 1, but never achieved an actual connection. I tried calling anyway, holding the phone to my ear. The sound that came through wasn't quite silence, more like an absence of sound, a void where sound should be. Then, so faint I almost missed it, someone whispered my name through the phone. I threw it onto the passenger seat, breathing hard now, tasting copper and fear. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me safe through 15 years of highway driving, screamed that there had to be an explanation. Gas leaks could cause hallucinations. Carbon monoxide poisoning. A stroke. Something medical. Something treatable. Something that didn't require the impossible to be real, but that wouldn't explain the signs. Wouldn't explain the fuel gauge or the headlights or the way the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead no matter how many miles I covered. Millbrook. 64 miles. The number had grown again, and this time I watched it happen. As I passed the sign, its face seemed to ripple like water, the digits reshaping themselves into a higher number. 64 miles. My destination was receding faster than I could approach it, the road actively pushing my goal further away with each turn of my wheels. The whispering grew more insistent, no longer just my name but phrases I couldn't quite make out. words that seemed to slide away from comprehension whenever I tried to focus on them. The voices, I realized there were multiple now, carried tones that ranged from urgent to pleading, to something that might have been amusement. They came from the radio, from the vents, from the empty air itself. I tried the CB again, desperate for any human contact. Is anyone out there? Anyone at all? I'm stuck on this road and I don't know. The words caught in my throat as a response came through, immediate and clear. My own voice, speaking from the CB speaker. Is anyone out there? Anyone at all? I'm stuck on this road and I don't know. An echo. A recording. But I was still holding the transmit button, still trying to speak, and my recorded voice continued playing, finishing sentences I hadn't yet said. Predicting my words or creating them, I couldn't tell which. The headlights behind me suddenly accelerated. Closing the distance that had remained constant for so long, I watched in the mirror as they grew larger, brighter, filling the entire frame with blinding white light. The engine sound that didn't quite match mine grew louder, that out-of-sync rhythm becoming deafening. I couldn't see the vehicle itself, just the lights, impossibly bright, impossibly close. Then they stopped, snapping back to their original distance, as if they'd never moved at all. My heart thundered in my chest, adrenaline making my hands shake on the wheel. The grass had stopped moving. Everything had stopped moving. Looking out at the walls of vegetation on either side, I realized they were perfectly still now, not even the faintest breeze disturbing them. The streetlights ahead no longer flickered. Even the road beneath my tires felt different, smoother, almost frictionless, as if I wasn't quite making contact with it anymore. Millbrook. 71 miles. 71 miles. The number had jumped by 7 this time, accelerating its impossible increase. At this rate, I'd never reach my destination. I'd drive forever on this road, watching the distance grow while my fuel never depleted, and those lights followed at their precise distance, and voices whispered my name from electronic devices that shouldn't have power. The thought that came next was worse. Maybe I already had been driving forever. Maybe there was no before this road, no gas station, no other driver with his grease-stained map. Maybe this had always been my existence, trapped in a cab that smelled of diesel and fear, watching mile markers count upward toward infinity, while something followed behind with the patient attention of a predator that knew its prey couldn't escape. I reached for the door handle, some desperate part of me ready to abandon the truck, to stumble into that wall of grass and take my chances with whatever waited there. But my hand passed through the handle like it wasn't there, like it was made of shadow rather than metal. I tried again, focusing all my attention on the simple act of gripping something solid, but my fingers found only air. The whispering stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, harsh and rapid. The engine continued its dual rhythm, but everything else had gone quiet. Even the static from the radio had ceased. The headlights behind me remained steady, and ahead, the road stretched on into darkness, the same as it had been for miles upon uncountable miles. Millbrook. 78 miles. I laughed, the sound high and thin and not entirely sane. 78 miles. The absurdity of it broke something loose in my chest. I was on a road that couldn't exist, being followed by lights without a vehicle, watching my destination recede toward infinity while voices that might have been in my head or in the radio or in the very air whispered secrets I couldn't understand. The grass began to move again, but differently now. It didn't sway. It reached. Long blades extending toward the road, toward my truck, hundreds of them stretching like fingers trying to touch something just beyond their grasp. In the glow of my headlights, I could see that the grass wasn't entirely grass. There were other things woven through it, pale and thin, that might have been branches or might have been something else. A new sign appeared ahead, but this one wasn't green. It was black, with white letters that seemed to glow with their own light. Thank you for visiting Millbrook. The kind of sign you saw when leaving a town, not approaching one. But I hadn't been to Millbrook. I was trying to reach it, watching it slip further away with each passing moment. Unless I'd already been there, unless I'd passed through it miles ago or hours ago or years ago, and just couldn't remember, the road could have looped, could have bent back on itself in ways that made the geometry of distance meaningless. I could have been driving in circles without knowing it, passing the same markers over and over while my mind insisted I was moving forward. The headlights behind me went dark. Complete absence where their light had been, turning my rearview mirror into a rectangle of perfect blackness. The relief I expected didn't come. Instead, the loss of those lights felt worse, like losing the one constant in this nightmare. At least when I could see them, I knew where they were. Now whatever had been following me could be anywhere. The engine sound that didn't match mine continued, growing louder. It came from behind, from ahead, from beneath my own truck. The vibration of it moved through the steering wheel, through the seat, through my bones. I could feel it in my teeth, in my skull, that out-of-sync rhythm building towards something I couldn't name but knew I didn't want to witness. My hands moved on the steering wheel without my conscious direction, turning it gently left, then right, then left again. The truck responded, weaving slightly on the road, but the view through the windshield never changed. Grass, road, darkness, streetlights. The same elements arranged in an eternal pattern that my brain kept insisting should vary, but never did. Millbrook, 85 miles. The number no longer surprised me. It could have been 95 or 905. The specific value had ceased to matter. What mattered was the relentless increase, the confirmation that whatever rules governed this road, they weren't the ones I'd spent my life learning to navigate. I thought about the wiry man at the gas station, his distant eyes and too wide smile. Had he known? Was he even real, or just another part of this place, luring in drivers who were foolish enough or tired enough to believe in shortcuts? Maybe he was sitting in the cab of his own truck somewhere on another stretch of this road, watching his own signs count upward, while other lights followed at impossible distances. Or maybe he'd escaped. Maybe there was an end to this, a trick I hadn't discovered, a turn I'd missed in my growing panic. But I'd been watching for turnoffs since the signs started counting backward. There'd been nothing, no exits, no intersections, no breaks in the grass walls that pressed close on either side. The whispering returned, but changed. No longer saying my name, it now spoke in rhythms that matched the dual engine sound, creating a kind of poetry that bypassed language entirely. I felt the meaning of it in my chest, in the hollow space behind my ribs where fear and understanding lived together. It spoke of roads that went nowhere, of destinations that existed only as concepts, of the space between departure and arrival stretched into infinity. The streetlights began to go out one by one, darkness swallowing them from ahead and working backward toward my position. I watched them die in sequence, each light guttering and fading until only the beam from my own headlights illuminated the road. Then that began to dim as well, slowly, inexorably, narrowing the tunnel of visibility until I could see only a few yards ahead. The grass on both sides had grown higher than the cab now, towering over me, blocking out even the suggestion of sky. I was driving through a corridor of vegetation with walls so close I felt I could reach out and touch them, if my hands could still interact with physical things. The air in the cab grew thick and heavy, harder to breathe, tasting of earth and decay and something else. Something sharp and metallic that made my tongue feel numb. Millbrook. 92 miles. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had burned through me and left something else in its place. A kind of hollow acceptance, an understanding that whatever was happening had already happened. Past tense, present tense, future tense. They blurred together on this road where distance and direction had lost their meaning. My eyes grew heavy, not from exhaustion now, but from something deeper. The kind of tiredness that came from accepting the inevitable, from understanding that fighting accomplished nothing. The steering wheel felt distant in my hands, the pedals uncertain beneath my feet. I could still see the road ahead, dim and fading, but it no longer seemed important whether I followed it or not. The engine sound, both sounds, the real and the echo, began to fade as well, dropping in volume until I could barely hear them at all. In their place, I heard other sounds, distant traffic, a radio playing familiar songs, the comfortable rumble of tires on well-maintained interstate, the sounds of the world I'd left behind, or thought I'd left behind. or might never have left at all. Millbrook, 100 miles. A perfect round number. Something final about it. Something that felt like an ending even though the road continued forward into darkness. My headlights dimmed to almost nothing, leaving me in a twilight where shapes lost their definition, and everything became suggestion rather than substance. I thought I saw other vehicles in the darkness alongside the road, trucks like mine, sitting silent in the grass with their lights off and cabs empty. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, lined up like tombstones marking the progress of drivers who'd taken the shortcut before me. But when I tried to look directly at them, they faded into the vegetation, indistinguishable from shadow. The whispering had become constant now, a background hum that no longer formed words, but simply existed, filling the spaces between thoughts. My name was in there somewhere, buried in the layers of sound, but so was everyone's name. Every driver who'd ever turned onto this road, lured by the promise of saving time, only to discover that time here worked differently. I felt myself fading with the lights, becoming less solid, less real. My hands on the steering wheel looked translucent, like I could see through them to the dashboard beyond. The cab around me seemed to be dissolving, or perhaps I was dissolving into it, the boundaries between driver and vehicle and road becoming fluid, uncertain. Ahead, through the near darkness, I saw something that might have been the end of the road, or might have been the beginning. A point where the grass walls opened up, where the pavement seemed to lead somewhere else. But I was moving so slowly now, or maybe not moving at all. Hard to tell when everything had become so distant and dreamlike. The lights behind me returned, filling my rearview mirror with their steady glow. They'd been there all along, I understood now. They'd always been there, would always be there, patient and eternal and watching, not following me because they didn't need to. They were already where they needed to be. Millbrook, 100 miles. The sign didn't change anymore. The number held steady, fixed at its perfect 100, not increasing, but not decreasing either. I'd reached equilibrium, the point where forward and backward meant the same thing, where the distance to my destination would remain constant no matter how long I drove my eyes closed. Not because I wanted them to, but because keeping them open required an effort I could no longer sustain. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I could still see the road, still feel the steering wheel in my hands, still hear the dual rhythm of engines and the whisper of voices speaking names that included mine, but weren't only mine. Somewhere, miles away, or moments away, or in a place where distance and time had no meaning, there was a gas station. A wiry man with distant eyes stood at a pump, waiting for the next driver to arrive. In his pocket, he carried napkins and a pen, ready to draw another map of shortcuts that saved time, that went nowhere, that led onto roads where the signs counted wrong, and the fuel never ran out, and destinations receded into infinity. I'd been that driver once. I might be that driver again. Or maybe I'd always been that driver, caught in a loop that had no beginning and no end, just an eternal middle where trucks rolled forward and lights followed behind and the grass reached towards something it could never quite touch. The road stretched ahead into darkness, and I drove on, because that's what drivers do. We drive, mile after mile, sign after sign, toward destinations we may never reach, on highways that may have no end, and behind us, always behind us, lights follow at precise distances, patient and constant and watching, waiting for the moment when we finally understand that there is no arrival, no departure, only the endless act of traveling through a darkness that looks like road. Story 4. The agreement came with exactly one rule, handwritten on a torn piece of notebook paper and taped to the refrigerator door. After 11 p.m., don't look out the kitchen window. I found it amusing at first, the kind of quirky local superstition you'd expect from a place this remote. The cabin sat 3 miles down a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained, surrounded by Douglas firs so tall they blocked out half the sky. The nearest neighbor was somewhere beyond the ridge, invisible and silent. The lake spread out behind the property like a sheet of hammered pew stone, reflecting nothing but trees and the occasional hawk circling overhead. Perfect for forgetting. That's what I told myself when I signed the month-long lease. transferring money to an account belonging to someone I'd never meet. The owner had left the keys under a rock shaped like a bear's head, along with that note. No welcome basket, no instructions for the temperamental water heater, just that single warning written in careful block letters. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I spent the daylight hours hiking the trails that wound through the property, trying to exhaust myself enough to sleep without dreaming. The evenings I filled with silence, sitting on the deck with a book I couldn't concentrate on, watching the light die across the water. The cabin was small, just a main room with a kitchenette, a bedroom barely large enough for the queen bed, and a bathroom with a shower that rattled when the pressure dropped. The construction was solid, though, old-growth timber that had weathered decades of mountain winters. The floorboards didn't creak, the doors hung straight in their frames. That's why I noticed when the sounds started on the 3rd night. I was washing dishes around 10:30, standing at the kitchen sink with my hands in soapy water when I heard the first footstep on the deck. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of weight that makes old wood groan. I froze, water dripping from my fingers, listening. Another step. Then another. Someone was walking along the perimeter of the deck, moving slowly past the living room windows toward the back of the cabin. My first thought was the owner, coming to check on the property. But it was late, and there'd been no headlights cutting through the trees, no sound of an engine. I dried my hands and walked to the front door, flipping on the porch light. The yellow glow spilled across empty planks, pine needles clustered in the corners, nothing else. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a full minute, feeling foolish, before turning off the light and returning to the kitchen. Probably an animal. A black bear, maybe, though they didn't usually climb onto structures. A deer would be too light. I finished the dishes, trying to convince myself, and checked my phone. No signal, as expected. The cabin had Wi-Fi, but it was spotty, dropping out for hours at a time. At 11 p.m. exactly, the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout. One moment I was reading by the lamp next to the couch, and the next I was sitting in absolute darkness. The refrigerator's hum died. The digital clock on the microwave went black. I fumbled for my phone, using its screen glow to navigate to the breaker box by the front door. Every switch was in the on position. I flipped them off and on again anyway. Nothing happened. The darkness in the mountains is different from city darkness. There are no streetlights bleeding through curtains, no ambient glow from neighboring buildings. When the moon is down and the clouds are thick, you could hold your hand an inch from your face and see nothing but the void. I stood in that void, my phone battery at 47%, trying to remember if I'd seen any candles or flashlights during my initial walkthrough of the cabin. That's when I heard the scratching. It came from the outside wall of the kitchen, a slow, rhythmic sound, like nails dragging across wood. Not frantic or aggressive, but methodical, deliberate. Something was moving along the exterior, and it was taking its time. I backed away from the kitchen entrance, my heartbeat suddenly loud in my ears, and pressed myself against the wall near the bathroom. The scratching continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard breathing that wasn't mine. It was soft, almost subvocal, coming from somewhere in the main room. I held my breath, straining to locate it. Near the couch? By the bookshelf? The darkness made it impossible to tell. Distances collapsed. Directions became meaningless. I stood frozen, my phone clutched in my sweating hand, trying to decide if I should turn on its flashlight or preserve the battery in case I needed to call for help. Signal forgotten or not. The breathing stopped. Then, from the kitchen, I heard a single word, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. Come. Every muscle in my body locked. The voice was low, male, but with something wrong in its cadence, like the speaker had learned English from recordings and never quite mastered the natural rhythm. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound inhuman either. It existed in some uncanny valley between the two. A voice that made my skin crawl without any rational explanation. I didn't move. I barely let myself breathe. After a minute that felt like an hour, the lights came back on. The refrigerator resumed its humming, The microwave clock blinked 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock. I was alone in the cabin, standing against the wall like I'd been caught in some schoolyard game of freeze tag. The front door was still locked. The windows were secure. There was no one in the kitchen, no one on the couch, no one anywhere. I checked every room, every closet, under the bed, behind the shower curtain empty. All of it empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that while I was searching one room, someone was slipping quietly into the one I'd just left, always staying just out of sight, just behind my turning head. I didn't sleep that night. The next day passed in a haze of exhaustion and second-guessing. In the daylight, with the sun burning off the morning mist and birds calling from the trees, the previous night felt like a dream state, a product of stress and isolation and too many nights of poor sleep. The cabin looked benign, almost cheerful, with light streaming through the windows and dust motes drifting through the air. I made breakfast, took a long shower, and forced myself to go for a hike, leaving the door unlocked because what was the point of locking it? If someone wanted in, they'd find a way. But as evening approached, my anxiety returned. The shadows grew longer. The temperature dropped. I found myself avoiding the kitchen, eating crackers and peanut butter in the living room instead of cooking dinner. At 10:30, I stood in front of that taped note on the refrigerator, reading it again and again. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the message absurdly simple. Why the kitchen window specifically? Why 11 p.m.? What happened if you looked? Part of me wanted to rip the note down, throw open the curtains, and stare out into the night until I understood whatever joke or warning or local legend lay behind it. The rational part. The part that was tired of being afraid of nothing. But the deeper part, the animal part that still remembered what it meant to be prey, whispered that some rules exist for good reasons. At 10:57, I retreated to the bedroom and shut the door. The footsteps returned at 11:03. Heavier this time, more numerous, like multiple people walking across the deck in a slow circle around the cabin. I lay in bed with my phone clutched to my chest, staring at the ceiling, counting the steps. 7 distinct sets, maybe 8, all moving in the same direction, clockwise. They'd pass the bedroom window, continue along the back wall, round the corner to the kitchen, then complete the circuit back to the front over and over, an endless procession. The scratching started around 11:15, concentrated on the kitchen wall again. But tonight it was accompanied by something else. A soft tapping on glass. Not the bedroom window. Not the living room windows. The kitchen window. Something was knocking, politely, persistently, asking to be let in, or asking for me to look out. The lights died at 11:23. I turned on my phone's flashlight this time, sweeping it around the bedroom. The beam caught nothing but my own belongings, my half-unpacked suitcase, my hiking boots by the door. I stood up, holding the light in front of me like a weapon, and moved to the bedroom door. My hand touched the knob. It was cold, colder than it should be, cold enough that it felt like touching ice. I didn't open it. Instead, I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. The footsteps had stopped. The scratching had stopped. But I could hear voices now, multiple voices, having a conversation in the main room. The words were indistinct, more like murmuring than speech, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Question, answer, laughter. Someone was telling a story, others were responding. It sounded like a dinner party in progress, casual and comfortable, as if a group of friends had simply let themselves into the cabin and settled in for the evening. I stayed pressed against the door until the lights came back on at 11:47. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, the main room was empty. The couch cushions were undisturbed. There were no extra glasses in the sink, no footprints on the floor. But the air felt different, warmer, like it had been recently occupied by living bodies. And there was a smell, faint but distinct, coffee and wood smoke and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that I couldn't identify. I spent the rest of the night in the bedroom with a chair wedged under the doorknob. The pattern repeated for the next 3 nights. The footsteps, the scratching, the voices, small variations each time, but following the same basic rhythm. The power would cut at 11 p.m., sometimes a minute before, sometimes a minute after, but always in that window. The sounds would build, layer upon layer, until it felt like the cabin was hosting an invisible gathering. Then, sometime before midnight, everything would stop. The lights would return. I'd be alone again, except I didn't feel alone. During the day, I started noticing things. Objects moved slightly from where I'd left them. The book on the coffee table would be on the other end. The kitchen towel would be refolded in a different way. My hiking boots, which I always left pointing toward the door, would be turned around, facing into the cabin's small things. Things that could be explained by faulty memory or unconscious movements. But they accumulated, a death by 1,000 paper cuts to my sense of security. I tried to leave on the 6th day, got in my car, started the engine, and made it maybe half a mile down the dirt road before I stopped. Not because the car broke down or the road was washed out, but because I realized I couldn't remember why I'd come here in the first place. The breakup? That felt distant, almost fictional. My old life? It seemed like something that had happened to someone else. The cabin had become the entire world, and everything outside its wooden walls felt abstract, unreal. I turned around and drove back. That night I stood in the living room at 10:55, staring at the kitchen entrance. The note was still taped to the refrigerator, visible from where I stood. The curtains were drawn over the kitchen window, heavy fabric that let no light in or out. 5 minutes. That's all I had to wait. 5 minutes, and then the nightly performance would begin, and I'd retreat to the bedroom like I had every night before. But this time, something was different. This time, as I watched the second hand sweep around the clock face, I felt a pull, an almost physical compulsion drawing me toward the kitchen. Not the bedroom. Not the front door. The kitchen. Specifically, the window. I took a step forward, then another. My feet moved without conscious decision, carrying me across the threshold into the kitchen space. The note rustled slightly as I passed, though there was no breeze. 3 minutes until 11 p.m. I stood in front of the curtained window, my hand reaching up, fingers touching the fabric's rough texture. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to stop. Rules exist, for reasons. Warnings aren't jokes. People who ignore them in horror stories die messy deaths. But I wasn't in a story, was I? I was in a rented cabin in the mountains, alone, slowly losing my grip on reality, and maybe, just maybe, looking out this window would break whatever spell had been cast, whatever game was being played with my sanity. 2 minutes. Ooh. My fingers closed around the curtain's edge. That's when I noticed the reflection in the glass. The curtain wasn't fully drawn. There was a gap, maybe 2 inches wide, where the two panels didn't quite meet. Through it, I could see the dark glass, and in that glass, I could see the reflection of the kitchen behind me, the refrigerator, gleaming white, the small table with 2 chairs, the doorway leading to the main room, and standing in that doorway, barely visible in the dim light, was someone else I didn't turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to confirm what I was seeing, but I remained frozen, staring at the reflection. The figure was tall, indistinct, more suggestion than solid form. It stood perfectly still, watching me watch it. 1 minute. I forced my eyes to focus on other parts of the reflected room, the stove, the countertop, the corner where I'd left my jacket hanging on a hook. And there in the corner, another figure, shorter than the first, but just as still, just as watchful. My breath came in shallow gasps. I scanned the entire reflection systematically, forcing myself to look at every visible surface. The doorway showed 3 figures now. No, 4. The corner had 2. One stood next to the refrigerator, close enough to touch if I turned around. Another was just behind me, perhaps 2 feet away, near enough that I should be able to feel its breath on my neck. The clock struck 11 p.m. The lights didn't go out. That was the first deviation from the pattern, and it terrified me more than anything that had come before. The lights stayed on, bright and harsh, and in their illumination, the reflected figures became clearer. They weren't quite people. Their proportions were wrong, limbs too long, heads tilted at angles that suggested broken necks. They didn't cast shadows. They didn't move. They simply stood there, arranged around the kitchen like guests at a viewing, all of them focused on me. I heard the footsteps again, but they were coming from inside the cabin now, walking through the main room, approaching the kitchen. Heavy, measured, deliberate. The sound of someone who had all the time in the world. My hand was still gripping the curtain. I could pull it aside. I could look out into the real darkness beyond the window, instead of at this nightmare reflection. That's what the rule said. Don't look out the window. It didn't say anything about looking at the glass itself, at the horrors reflected in its surface. But I was beginning to understand that maybe the rule wasn't about protecting me from what was outside. The footsteps reached the kitchen threshold. In the reflection, I watched another figure enter the frame, taller than the others, more solid. It moved with a fluidity they lacked, walking past the motionless watchers until it stood directly behind me. I could see its hand reaching out, hovering just above my shoulder, not quite touching. That's when I made my mistake. I turned around. The kitchen was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No figures, no shapes, no signs that anyone had been there at all. I spun in a full circle, searching every corner, checking behind the refrigerator, looking under the table. Nothing. The main room beyond was dark but vacant. The front door was still locked. Slowly, with a dread that sat in my stomach like cold stone, I turned back to the window. The figures in the reflection hadn't moved. They stood in exactly the same positions, surrounding empty air where I should be. But I wasn't in the reflection anymore. The kitchen behind me showed in perfect detail. The appliances, the furniture, the doorway. But the space where I stood, the volume of air and flesh that constituted me, cast no reflection at all. I raised my hand and waved it. Nothing appeared in the glass. The figure that had stood behind me, the tall one, was still there in the reflection, but now it occupied the space where my reflection should be. It stood in my position, looking out through the glass at something I couldn't see. Its head tilted slowly, regarding whatever lay beyond the window, with what might have been curiosity or hunger or satisfaction. Then, moving with terrible gentleness, it reached up and began to pull the curtain aside. I stumbled backward, away from the window, and felt my back hit something solid. Not the refrigerator, not the wall, something that hadn't been there a moment before, something that gave slightly under my weight, yielding like flesh wrapped in cloth. I lurched forward, off balance, and caught myself on the counter. When I looked back, there was nothing behind me but empty kitchen. But I could feel it now. A presence so close it was almost intimate breath that didn't disturb the air. A weight that didn't register on the floorboards. I was sharing the space with something, and it was sharing the space with me, and we were occupying the same coordinates in a way that shouldn't be possible, that violated every law of physics I understood. The lights flickered once, twice. In the stuttering illumination, I thought I saw them, not in the corners or doorways, but overlapping with the furniture, with the walls, with the space I inhabited. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all standing or sitting or kneeling in a geography that existed sideways to the one I could see. A whole population living in the same square footage, breathing the same air, moving through rooms I couldn't perceive. When the lights steadied, they were gone again. But now I knew they were still there, had always been there, would always be there. I walked to the bedroom on legs that barely supported me and lay down on the bed. I didn't bother with the chair under the doorknob this time. What was the point? There was no door that could keep them out, because they'd never been outside to begin with. We'd been cohabiting this entire time. Me in my version of the cabin, them in theirs. The two realities pressed together like pages in a book, separate but touching. The note hadn't been a warning to protect me from them. It had been a warning to protect them from being seen. Sleep came eventually, though I didn't want it to. I dreamed of standing in the kitchen, watching my own body walk through the main room, making coffee, reading on the couch, going about a morning routine I couldn't remember performing. In the dream, I pressed my palm against the glass of the kitchen window, trying to get my own attention, trying to warn myself about what was coming, but the version of me on the other side never looked up. When I woke the next morning, everything seemed normal. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window. Birds sang in the trees outside. I made breakfast in the kitchen, careful not to look at the window, keeping my eyes focused on the stove, the refrigerator, the mundane tasks of cracking eggs and brewing coffee. Only occasionally, in my peripheral vision, did I catch movement. A shadow passing behind me, where no shadow should be. The suggestion of a hand reaching past my shoulder to open a cabinet I'd just closed. The sense that someone was standing exactly where I stood, reaching for exactly what I reached for, going through their own morning routine in their own version of this space. The rental agreement had 3 weeks left on it. My phone gets brief windows of signal sometimes, enough to check email, enough to see messages from people asking where I am. When I'm coming back, I've started to respond that I'm not sure, that I might extend the lease, that it's peaceful here, restorative, exactly what I needed. It's not a lie exactly. I've stopped hearing the footsteps at night, stopped hearing the scratching. The voices have faded to a background hum, indistinguishable from the wind in the trees or the lapping of the lake against the shore. We've reached an accommodation, all of us who live here. In our separate but together reality, I still don't look out the kitchen window after 11 p.m. That rule remains unbroken. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror or the dark screen of my dead laptop, I notice that I look different. My proportions seem wrong, my movements slightly asynchronous with my intentions, and I wonder if I'm seeing myself as they see me, from their angle of reality, or if I'm becoming one of them. Last night, I heard footsteps on the deck again, but this time they were familiar. They matched the rhythm of my own gait, the weight of my own body. When they stopped at the kitchen window, I heard tapping on the glass. Polite, persistent, patient. Someone was out there, looking in, watching me go about my evening routine. Someone who hadn't learned yet that some windows are better left dark, some reflections better left unexamined. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to go to the door, unlock it, step outside and explain what they were about to become. But I was afraid that if I opened the door, I wouldn't be able to tell which side of it I was actually on, which version of the cabin I was exiting, whether I was walking out into the mountain night or deeper into something that only looked like the mountain night. So I went to bed instead, leaving the warning note exactly where it was, hoping the next person would read it more carefully than I did. The clock reads 10:54 p.m. now. In 6 minutes, something will happen. Maybe the lights will go out. Maybe I'll hear voices. Maybe I'll see figures that aren't there, or stop seeing figures that are. Or maybe, for the first time since I looked at that reflection, nothing will happen at all. And I'm not sure which possibility frightens me more. Story 5. The company stopped sending people in pairs after the incident 3 years ago. They never told me what happened, just that it was more cost-effective this way. More cost-effective. That's what they called it when they handed me the assignment sheet for Section 7, the stretch that cuts through the old marsh where the ground never quite solidifies, where the mist hangs so thick you could scoop it with your hands. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every railway worker had. The maintenance crew that found tools arranged in perfect circles. The inspector who swore he saw lights moving beneath the water. The supervisor who came back speaking in fragments, unable to complete a sentence, and took early retirement 2 weeks later. But stories are just stories until you're standing in the mud at 3 in the morning with nothing but a flashlight and a radio that crackles with static even when it's turned off. The truck groaned to a halt at mile marker 47, as far as the access road would take me. From here, it was a 2-mile walk along the tracks to inspect the rails, check for stress fractures, document any irregularities, standard procedure. I'd done it 100 times on other sections. But as I stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, the marsh exhaled a breath that smelled of rust and rotting vegetation, and something in my chest tightened. The mud sucked at my boots immediately. Each step required effort, a deliberate extraction from the earth's grip. My flashlight beam cut through the mist in a cone of sickly yellow light, illuminating the tracks ahead in brief, stuttering glimpses. The ties looked newer than they should have been, given the maintenance logs. Someone had replaced them recently, though no work orders existed for this section. I made a mental note to ask about it when I got back, knowing even then that I probably wouldn't. I walked for maybe 10 minutes before I noticed the first set of prints. They appeared just at the edge of my flashlight's reach, running parallel to my own path boot prints, the same size as mine, pressed into the soft earth beside the tracks. The sensible part of my brain suggested I'd somehow circled back, that the marsh was disorienting my sense of direction, but I'd been walking in a straight line along the rails, and these prints were on my right side, fresh and deep, filling slowly with murky water. I stopped. The marsh didn't. It breathed and gurgled and whispered in languages that predated human speech. Somewhere far off, something splashed. The sound carried strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. I swept my flashlight across the landscape, but the beam only penetrated a few feet into that wall of fog before dissipating into useless gray nothing. When I looked back down, there were more prints. They extended ahead of me now, as though whoever made them had continued walking while I'd paused impossible. I would have heard them. The mud was too soft, too eager to announce any intrusion. Yet there they were, each impression perfect and distinct. The tread pattern identical to my own boots. I reached down and touched the edge of one print. The mud was warm. Body temperature warm. My fingers came away coated in silt that felt too thick. Too alive, I wiped them on my jacket and kept walking, faster now, telling myself that ground temperature variations were normal in marshland, that thermal pockets existed, that there were rational explanations for everything if you just looked hard enough. The tracks stretched ahead, twin lines of steel disappearing into the mist. I focused on them, on the familiar geometry of railroad maintenance. Check for cracks, look for displacement, document, move forward. Simple routine, safe. But with each inspection point, I became more aware of the presence beside me. Not a sound, not a sight, just a certainty that grew in my bones like a cold ache. Someone was walking parallel to my path, matching my pace exactly, never quite visible in the flashlight beam. I tried calling out once. My voice died in the mist, absorbed so completely it was as if I'd never made a sound at all. The marsh swallowed it whole and gave nothing back, not even an echo. The silence that followed felt intentional, like the moment before a held breath is released. My radio crackled, just static at first, the white noise that fills dead air. Then, underneath, something else. A rhythm, almost like breathing. I lifted the radio to my ear, turning the volume down, and heard it clearly. The slow, steady inhalation and exhalation of someone trying very hard to breathe quietly. When I released the talk button, it stopped. When I pressed it again, it resumed, perfectly synchronized with my own breathing. I clipped the radio back to my belt and kept walking. The prints continued beside me, appearing in the flashlight beam and vanishing behind me into darkness. At one point, I stopped abruptly, hoping to catch them mid-formation. But when I turned the light back, they simply existed, as though they'd always been there, filling with water at exactly the rate mine did. The thing that finally broke my composure wasn't the prints or the radio or even the feeling of being accompanied by something that shouldn't exist. It was the realization that the prints beside me never sank as deep as mine. They pressed into the surface, left clear impressions, but didn't break through that top layer of mud the way a real person's weight would. The marsh was too soft here, too eager to swallow. I'd sunk to my ankles twice already. Yet these other prints remained shallow, surface level, as though made by someone who weighed almost nothing at all, or something that wasn't quite standing on the ground. I don't remember deciding to run. My body simply started moving faster, boots splashing through standing water, flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the tracks. The prints kept pace. No matter how fast I moved, they appeared just ahead of me, leading the way through the marsh like a guide I'd never asked for. My breathing came in ragged gasps, and I realized the sound on the radio had changed pitch, matching my panic perfectly. That's when I felt it. A hand, or something approximating a hand, brush against my shoulder, not grabbing, just touching, the way you might tap someone to get their attention. The contact came through my jacket as a sensation of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of absence, of space where warmth should exist but doesn't. I spun around, flashlight raised like a weapon, and saw nothing but mist and mud and the tracks disappearing behind me. But there, in the beam's dying light at the edge of visibility, a shape. Human-sized, human-shaped. Standing perfectly still in the marsh. Though the ground there looked even softer than where I stood, it didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was statement enough. I backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on that spot, watching for movement. The shape remained motionless, and as I put distance between us, it seemed to fade rather than shrink, becoming less solid, less defined, until I couldn't tell if it was still there, or if the mist had simply reclaimed that space. But I felt its attention follow me, patient and unwavering. The inspection points became a blur. I marked them mechanically, muscle memory taking over while my conscious mind tried to process what I'd seen or hadn't seen or thought I'd seen. The distinction had stopped mattering. My hands shook as I filled out the checklist, numbers and observations that seemed absurdly mundane given the circumstances. Everything nominal. Rails within tolerance, no immediate safety concerns. The routine language of someone pretending everything was normal. I was nearly finished, maybe a quarter mile from where I could cut back to the truck, when I heard the train. The distant rumble reached me first, traveling through the rails before the sound hit my ears. A freight train, probably, running the late-night route through the marsh. Standard schedule, nothing unusual, except as the rumble grew closer, my radio exploded with noise. Not static this time. Voices, screaming, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, overlapping in a chorus of terror that made my stomach clench. They weren't speaking English or any language I recognized. They were just pure vocalized fear, the sound of people dying or thinking they were dying or trapped in that terrible moment between life and whatever comes after. The volume increased as the train approached, until I had to tear the radio from my belt and throw it into the mud just to escape the sound. But throwing it away didn't help. The screaming continued, emanating from the air itself now, from the mist, from the very ground beneath my feet. It built to a crescendo as the train's headlight finally pierced the fog, a single yellow eye rushing toward me through the darkness. I stumbled off the tracks, sinking immediately into deeper mud, and the train roared past in a blast of wind and diesel fumes and screaming metal. In each window, as the cars flashed by, I saw faces. Pale, pressed against the glass, mouths open, eyes wide, dozens of them, hundreds, all watching me as they passed, all screaming without sound now that the train itself had swallowed their voices. The freight cars carried nothing but darkness and those faces, and I couldn't tell if they were reflections or passengers or something the marsh wanted me to see. Then it was gone, red taillights vanishing into the mist, and the screaming stopped so abruptly, the silence felt like a physical blow. I stood there in the mud, sunk to my shins now, breathing in short gasps that produced clouds of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. My flashlight had fallen during my scramble off the tracks. It lay half submerged, beam pointing up at an angle that created strange shadows in the hanging mist. I retrieved it with shaking hands and pointed the light back at the tracks. The boot prints were gone, all of them, mine and the others. The mud beside the rails looked smooth and undisturbed, as though no one had walked there in years. Even my own trail back toward the truck had vanished, leaving me standing in a landscape that insisted I'd never been there at all. But in the mud directly in front of me, so close I nearly stepped on it, was a single print, deeper than the others had been, distinct, deliberate. and it was filling with water that reflected the flashlight beam in a way that made the impression look hollow, like a void pressed into the earth. As I watched, more water welled up from some underground source, flooding the print until it overflowed. Spreading outward in a perfect circle that stopped just short of my boots. I ran. There's no dignity in admitting it, but that's what happened. I ran back toward where the truck should have been, splashing through standing water, falling twice in my panic, hauling myself up and continuing. The flashlight beam showed me nothing but endless marsh and those twin steel rails that seemed to stretch into infinity. The truck's distance marker should have appeared within minutes, but I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning, legs cramping, mind fracturing into smaller and smaller pieces of coherent thought. When I finally saw the access road, I nearly collapsed with relief. The truck sat exactly where I'd left it, patient and real and blessedly mundane. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there shaking while the windows fogged with my breath. The radio mounted in the dashboard crackled once, twice, then fell silent. I didn't dare turn it on. Dawn came slowly, bleeding gray light through the mist. In the growing visibility, I could see the track stretching back into the marsh, innocent and empty. No prints, no shapes, no evidence of anything but railroad and mud and morning fog. I filled out my report in the truck's cab, hands still trembling, and wrote that everything was within normal parameters. All inspections completed, no anomalies detected. The lie came easily, too easily. I drove back to the maintenance depot as the sun fully rose, trying to convince myself it had been exhaustion, that night shifts in isolated places play tricks on the mind, that fear creates its own reality. But when I got out of the truck and looked down at my boots, I saw them. Traces of mud that had dried in strange patterns, almost like fingerprints, as though something had run its hands along the leather while I walked. The supervisor barely glanced at my report, just filed it with the others in a cabinet that looked older than the building itself. He asked the question with the same casual tone he used for asking about weather. Any problems with Section 7? I told him no. He nodded, unsurprised, and said they'd probably send me back out there next month. It was good to have someone reliable for that stretch. Not everyone could handle it. I didn't ask what he meant by that. I'm not sure I wanted to know. 3 weeks later, I received next month's assignment schedule. Section 7 was listed again. Same time slot, same mile markers. I held the paper and stared at those numbers until they stopped meaning anything. That night, I dreamed of walking beside the tracks with someone matching my stride perfectly, though whenever I tried to look at them directly, there was only mist and the sound of breathing that wasn't quite my own. I haven't decided yet if I'll go back. The rational part of my brain says I should quit, that no job is worth that kind of psychological toll. But there's another part, growing stronger each day, that wants to return. Not despite what happened, but because of it. Because now I know the prints appear for a reason, even if I don't understand what that reason is. Because the faces in the train windows looked like they were trying to tell me something. Because the marsh has opened a door I can't quite close, and walking away would mean leaving it ajar forever. The radio still sits in the mud at mile marker 48, unless someone else retrieved it. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear it crackling, picking up frequencies that shouldn't exist, transmitting voices from places that might not be places at all. And sometimes, when I look at the mud stains on my boots, stains that won't wash out no matter how hard I scrub, I wonder if those fingerprints are holding on to me, or if I'm holding on to them. Next month's inspection is in 14 days. The calendar on my wall has it circled in red. A date approaching with the inevitability of sunrise, I catch myself planning what I'll bring differently, what precautions I might take, what questions I should ask if I encounter those prints again, as though preparation could make a difference, as though knowing what might happen could somehow protect me from it. But the truth, the thing I'm only now beginning to admit to myself as I sit here in my apartment staring at those red circled numbers, is simpler and more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. I'm not sure I want to be protected. Something in the marsh recognized me, walked beside me, matched my breathing and my stride and my very presence in that forgotten place. And now, God help me, I recognize it too. The question isn't whether I'll go back. The question is whether I ever really left Story 6. The first thing I noticed about Unit 407 was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you'd expect from a newly built condominium on the city's outskirts, but something denser, the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums until you became aware of your own pulse, the wet click of your throat when you swallowed. I stood in the empty living room that first afternoon, surrounded by moving boxes, and felt that silence wrap around me like a second skin. The real estate agent had been almost embarrassed when she'd shown me the place. 24 units across 6 floors, she'd explained, and only 3 were occupied. Construction had finished 8 months ago, but the developer had gone bankrupt before the marketing push. The price reflected the desperation I'd signed the lease within a week. My laptop found its usual spot on the dining table overlooking the parking lot, where my car sat alone except for 2 others at the far end. The view stretched past the condominium's gates to empty lots and half-finished roads that promised future development. Everything here existed in a state of waiting. The work kept me anchored those first few days. Video calls with colleagues who inhabited worlds of crowded coffee shops and traffic complaints. I'd mute myself between speaking, suddenly self-conscious of how my voice sounded in all that emptiness. Sometimes I'd catch myself holding my breath, listening for proof I wasn't completely alone in the building. I met one neighbor on the 3rd day, an older man from the 2nd floor who'd introduced himself in the lobby with a firm handshake and weary eyes. He'd asked how I was settling in, nodded when I said fine, then mentioned he'd be traveling for work most of the month. I watched him drive away that evening and felt the building exhale around me. The sound started on the 7th night. I'd been reviewing a client presentation, the blue light from my screen the only illumination in the apartment, when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside. Not hurried, not furtive, just the steady rhythm of someone walking past my door. I glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a full minute before I convinced myself to check the peephole. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, illuminated by emergency lights that cast everything in shades of gray. I stood there long enough for my knees to ache, watching nothing happen. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it. The building settling, pipes expanding, my own mind conjuring company in the isolation. But that night, at 3:03 a.m., I heard them again. Footsteps, followed by a new sound that made my skin prickle. The distinctive scrape and roll of wheeled luggage being pulled across tile. I didn't check the peephole that time. I sat frozen at my desk, tracking the sound as it moved past my door, continued down the hallway, and faded into nothing. When silence returned, it felt heavier than before, as if whatever had passed had displaced the air itself. 3 nights later, the superintendent left a notice under my door about security camera installation. The building's owners, hoping to make the property more attractive to potential buyers, had finally invested in a surveillance system. I felt an unexpected surge of relief. The footage changed everything. I'd been casually friendly with the superintendent, a middle-aged man who seemed grateful for any human interaction. When I mentioned the nighttime sounds, he'd offered to show me the recordings without hesitation. His small office smelled of instant coffee and concrete dust. He pulled up the hallway camera feed for the previous night. We watched in real-time speed. Nothing. Then at 2:54 a.m., a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. My breath caught. Someone was walking down the corridor toward my door, but the image was wrong. The figure moved with normal human gait, normal human proportions, but where its face should have been, the camera showed only a smear of pixels, as if someone had taken an eraser to that specific portion of the frame. The distortion didn't extend to the rest of the body or the background, just the face, blurred into incomprehensibility. The figure stopped directly in front of my door, stood there for 1 minute and 37 seconds, then turned and walked back the way it had come, pulling what was unmistakably a suitcase behind it, though the camera's microphone picked up no sound. The superintendent's hand shook slightly as he closed the video player. He'd reviewed the footage before showing me, he admitted. It was the same on every camera, every angle. For the past 4 nights between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., figures appeared in the hallways. Always alone, always with those blurred faces, always stopping at occupied units before moving on, including his unit. We sat in silence for a moment before I asked the question we were both avoiding. Had he checked who was coming and going through the main entrance? He nodded slowly. According to the lobby camera, no one had entered or exited the building during those hours. Not on any of the nights in question. I started sleeping in shifts after that, or trying to brief fractured stretches of unconsciousness that left me feeling more exhausted than when I'd closed my eyes. During the day, I found myself standing at the window, watching the empty parking lot, the vacant units with their curtainless windows like dark eyes. The building had begun to feel less like a structure and more like something living, something that breathed around me while I worked. The rational part of my mind offered explanations: camera malfunctions, the superintendent's own isolation-induced paranoia, my own stress manifesting in somatic ways. I'd mentioned the situation to a colleague during a video call, carefully framing it as a funny anecdote about a creepy new place. She'd laughed and suggested I watch fewer horror movies. I'd laughed too, and the sound had seemed to echo strangely in my apartment. 2 weeks in, I started researching other places to live. Nothing serious, just browsing listings during lunch breaks, imagining myself back in a building with functioning elevators and neighbors who existed during daylight hours. The thought settled over me like a warm blanket. That night, the sounds intensified. It started at 2:38 a.m. Not just footsteps this time, but multiple sets, overlapping and arrhythmic. The scrape of luggage had multiplied into a chorus, wheels catching and releasing on the hallway tile in a syncopated rhythm that made my teeth ache. I pressed my ear against the door and heard something else underneath it all. Breathing. Multiple sources of it, heavy and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was exerting itself with great effort. The sounds lasted for 43 minutes. I timed it. When silence finally returned, I checked the peephole with trembling hands. The hallway looked the same as always. Emergency lights, beige walls, the worn path down the center of the carpet where maintenance carts had rolled during construction. No evidence that anything had been there at all. The next morning, I found the superintendent waiting by my car. He looked worse than I felt, dark circles carved deep beneath his eyes. Before I could speak, he asked if I'd heard them too. I nodded. He'd reviewed the footage already, he said. Last night, 12 figures had appeared in the hallways. 12 separate entities with their obliterated faces, all stopping at the 3 occupied units. Some had stood at the doors for over 20 minutes. He'd called the camera company, he told me. They'd insisted it was impossible for the equipment to malfunction in such a specific way. They were sending a technician next week. I told him I was thinking about leaving, finding a new place, breaking the lease if I had to. The words felt important to say out loud, to make real. His expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. Relief? Fear? He confessed he'd been thinking the same thing. In fact, he'd already started looking at other jobs, other buildings to manage. Maybe we could both be out by the end of the month. The idea of escape felt intoxicating. I spent the entire day searching for apartments, sending inquiry emails, calculating breaking fees. By evening, I'd scheduled 3 viewings for the following week. I fell asleep easily for the first time in days, dreaming of buildings with occupied units and the ambient noise of normal human life. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of my doorknob turning. My body locked into complete stillness, every muscle tense to the point of pain. The knob twisted slowly, deliberately, testing the lock's resistance, then stopped. Then tried again, with more force this time. The entire door shuddered in its frame. From the hallway came sounds I couldn't reconcile with anything human. Not quite dragging, not quite scraping, but something wet and persistent, as if something was being pulled across the floor that left a trail behind it. The breathing had returned too, but closer now, just on the other side of the door. I could hear the whistle of it through the gap at the bottom. Then, silence. Complete and absolute, as if someone had thrown a switch. Even my own breathing seemed to have stopped. I lay there in the dark, unable to move, unable to even turn my head toward the door, until dawn light began to creep across the ceiling. The superintendent didn't answer his phone that morning. I found his office empty, his coffee maker still warm, his computer left running with security footage paused on the screen. The timestamp read 3:12 a.m. The image showed the fourth-floor hallway, my hallway, filled with figures. Not 12 this time. 20, 30, maybe more, packed so densely that their blurred faces overlapped into a singular mass of corrupted pixels, all of them facing my door. I drove to 3 apartment viewings that afternoon, my hands never quite steady on the wheel. Each place seemed perfect. Neighbors moving in the hallways, children's toys in the courtyard, the ambient buzz of television sets and conversations through walls. I could sign a lease immediately, the landlords assured me. I could move in within days, but sitting in each living room, imagining my furniture arranged in these new spaces, I felt something clench in my chest. A resistance I couldn't name, couldn't rationalize. The thought of packing my belongings, of hiring movers, of going through the administrative tedium of updating my address, suddenly seemed insurmountable, exhausting beyond measure. I told each landlord I'd think about it and get back to them. I drove back to the condominium as the sun set, painting the empty lots in shades of amber and rust. The building's silence greeted me like an old friend. Familiar now, almost comfortable in its consistency. I unpacked my laptop at the dining table, the same position I'd occupied for weeks, and felt myself settle into the space like a key finding its lock. That night I didn't hear the footsteps because I was already standing in the hallway, waiting for them. I don't remember making the decision to open my door at 2:47 a.m. Don't remember walking into the corridor or why I brought my suitcase with me, the one I'd used for the move, now packed with clothes I have no memory of folding. The emergency lights cast everything in that familiar gray, and the hallway stretched longer than it should, longer than physics would allow in a building with finite dimensions. Other doors were opening now, figures emerging into the corridor, each pulling luggage behind them with that distinctive scraping sound. I tried to see their faces, but my eyes kept sliding away from where features should be, as if my vision itself was corrupted, unable to focus on what was actually there. We stood in the hallway together, all of us, waiting. For what? I'm not certain. The building breathed around us, and I understood finally that it wasn't waiting at all. It was full, had always been full, would always be full. The thought of leaving felt distant now, absurd even, like trying to remember a dream upon waking, the details slipping away the harder you grasped for them. Where would I go? What would be the point? I think about calling someone sometimes, my family, my colleagues, anyone from the world I used to inhabit. But when I pick up my phone, I can never quite remember their numbers, and the contact list displays names I don't recognize. The video calls have stopped, or maybe I stopped answering them. Time has become difficult to track in ways that don't feel concerning. The superintendent's office remains empty, his computer still displaying that frozen moment of the hallway filled with us. Sometimes I sit in his chair and watch the live feed instead. The cameras show what they've always shown. Empty corridors, vacant spaces. Nothing unusual at all. Just a building waiting to be filled. I've stopped checking the real estate listings. Stopped imagining myself anywhere else. At night, when I hear the footsteps beginning their circuit, I sometimes open my door and watch them pass. The figures nod at me now, a gesture of recognition, of belonging. I nod back. My lease expires in 6 months. The thought occurs to me occasionally, floating through my mind like debris on water, but I've already decided I'll renew. The price is still good after all, and I've grown accustomed to the quiet, to the space, to the particular quality of light that filters through the windows of Unit 407. Besides, moving would be such an ordeal. The packing, the planning, the upheaval of routine. Why go through all that trouble when I'm perfectly comfortable here? Last night, I found myself standing in the hallway at 3 a.m., though I don't recall leaving my apartment. My suitcase was beside me, and when I looked down the corridor, I saw the others. All of us together, waiting in that familiar gray light. Someone new was visible through the camera's eye. Another figure with a blurred face, standing motionless in front of a door that had been closed for months. I wondered, briefly, what they looked like. If their features dissolved the same way mine must, caught in that strange distortion that prevents the cameras from seeing us clearly. If they felt the same comfort I do, standing here in the hallway, finally home. The building breathes around me, and I breathe with it. Tomorrow I have work to do, calls to take, a life to maintain that feels increasingly like a performance for an audience that stopped watching long ago. But tonight, I'm part of something larger, something that doesn't require me to leave, to change, to disrupt the pattern I've created. I think I'll take my suitcase back inside now. The hallway is emptying, the others returning to their units one by one. The superintendent's replacement starts next week, I heard. Someone new to help maintain the building, to monitor the cameras, to welcome fresh tenants to the handful of units still listed as vacant. I wonder if they'll hear the footsteps too, on their first night. I wonder if they'll think about leaving, about finding somewhere else. Anywhere else. I wonder how long it will take before they realize, as I have, that the thought of leaving is exactly what keeps us here. The lock clicks behind me with a sound like finality. Outside my window, the parking lot holds 3 cars now, though I'm certain there were only 2 when I arrived. The empty lots stretch into darkness, and somewhere beyond them, the city continues its indifferent existence, full of people who leave and arrive and move through their lives with enviable certainty. I sit at my laptop, the screen casting its blue glow across my face, and open my email. There's a message from the property management company. They're offering renewal incentives for current tenants, reduced rent, upgraded appliances, a gesture of gratitude for our patience during the building's slow start. My cursor hovers over the reply button. The apartment is quiet around me, that dense and pressing silence I've learned to cherish. In a few hours, my alarm will sound, and I'll begin another day of video calls and deadlines and the small performances that constitute a life. But tonight, in this stillness, I type my response. I'd be happy to renew my lease. I've grown quite attached to Unit 407. I hit send before I can reconsider. The building seems to settle around me, satisfied. From somewhere above, I hear the faint scrape of wheels on tile, though all the other units are supposedly empty. I don't bother to investigate. I know now that some sounds are meant to be heard but not questioned, accepted but not understood. The vacancy, I've learned, was never about empty apartments. It was about the space between staying and leaving, between the intention to go and the inability to do so. We fill that space, all of us who thought we were choosing this place, but were perhaps chosen instead. My reflection stares back at me from the darkened window, and for just a moment, I can't quite make out the details of my face. The image seems blurred, as if something about me refuses to be captured clearly, to be seen for what I've become. I blink, and the moment passes. My face returns to normal, or what I remember as normal. Outside, the night continues its vigil. The building breathes. I breathe with it, and somewhere down the hall, a door opens, then quietly closes, then opens again. Tomorrow, I think, I should call someone. Let them know I'm doing well, that I've settled in, that I've found a place where I truly belong. But tonight, I'm exactly where I need to be. The hallway calls, and soon, very soon, I know I'll answer. Story 7. The first thing I noticed when I came back to Millbrook was how the prison looked smaller than I remembered. I'd driven past the Eastfield Correctional Facility maybe 1,000 times growing up, always from the passenger seat of my mother's sedan, always on the way to somewhere else. The building squatted on the eastern edge of town like a concrete tumor, its watchtowers visible from the highway, its razor wire catching the afternoon sun in ways that made me look away. Back then, it seemed enormous, a fortress that swallowed the horizon. Now, standing in my childhood bedroom at 32, looking through the same window I'd looked through at 12, I could see the whole structure clearly. It looked almost manageable, almost ordinary, except it wasn't ordinary anymore. The state had shut it down 8 months ago, relocating the inmates to a newer facility closer to the capital. The fence still stood, but the lights in the watchtowers had gone dark. Weeds were already claiming the parking lot. Lucas called me on my second night back. We'd been close in high school, lost touch through college, reconnected sporadically through social media. He did urban exploration now, documenting abandoned places for a YouTube channel that had a modest following. His voice carried that particular enthusiasm people get when they're trying to sell you on something they've already decided to do. "The prison's wide open," he said. "Security's gone. Most of the fencing's still up, but there's a service entrance around back that's completely unsecured. I checked it out yesterday." I was sitting on my parents' back porch, watching the moths circle the porch light. The prison was just visible beyond the tree line, a darker shadow against the dark sky. "Why would I want to go inside a prison?" I asked. "Because it's incredible. Because the content would be amazing. Because when else are you going to get the chance?" I'd come back to Millbrook to help my parents sort through decades of accumulated possessions before their move to Florida. The work was tedious and lonely. Most of my old friends had scattered to other cities, other lives. The thought of spending an evening doing something, anything, other than boxing up old photograph albums had its appeal. "When?" I asked. "Tonight, midnight. The darkness makes it better on camera." I should have said no. The service entrance was exactly where Lucas said it would be, tucked behind a copse of dying elm trees on the facility's northwest corner. The gate hung open, its chain link sagging where bolt cutters had done their work. Lucas carried 2 flashlights and a camera with a mounted LED panel. I carried my phone in a growing sense that this was a spectacularly bad idea. "Motion sensors are dead," Lucas whispered, as we approached the main building. "Cameras, too. The state cut all the power when they transferred the last inmates." The building's exterior was worse up close than it had ever looked from the road. Decades of weather had stained the concrete in streaks of rust and green. Windows on the upper floors gaped like empty eye sockets, their glass long since shattered or removed. The loading dock door stood partially open, and Lucas slipped through the gap without hesitation. I followed, stepping from the cool October night into a darkness that felt thicker than it should. The smell hit me first, mildew and decay, but underneath that, something else, something organic and sour that made my sinuses burn. Lucas swept his flashlight beam across what appeared to be a service corridor, its walls lined with defunct electrical panels and water-stained notices about safety protocols that no one would ever follow again. "We'll start with cell block C," Lucas said, his voice echoing oddly in the confined space. "That's where most of the interesting stuff is." "What interesting stuff?" "You'll see." We moved deeper into the facility, following corridors that branched and intersected in ways that made me lose track of direction almost immediately. Lucas seemed to know where he was going, his camera panning smoothly across empty guard stations and abandoned equipment lockers. I tried to focus on following him, on not tripping over the debris that littered the floor, but I kept getting distracted by the sounds. Dripping water, obviously. The building was full of it, steady percussion from burst pipes and failing seals. But there were other sounds too, distant clangs that might have been settling metal, or might have been something else. A low, rhythmic humming that I thought was coming from residual electricity in the walls, until Lucas turned off his LED panel for a dramatic shot, and the humming continued in the darkness. "You hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" The humming stopped. Cell Block C announced itself with a massive steel door that stood wedged open, its hydraulic mechanism frozen in mid-swing beyond it. A long hallway stretched into shadow, lined on both sides with cell doors. Lucas's camera light played across them, and I saw that many stood open, their interiors visible in slices of illumination. "This is perfect," Lucas breathed, already filming. "Look at this. It's like they all just walked out one day and never came back." He was right, and that was what made it wrong. The cells weren't empty. They were abandoned, which isn't the same thing at all. A book lay open on a cot in one cell, its pages yellowed and curling but still legible. The next cell over had a coffee mug sitting on a small metal desk, dried residue coating its interior. Letters and photographs were pinned to walls. A chess game sat half-finished, pieces still arranged as if waiting for players who would never return. Why would they leave all this? I asked. Wouldn't the inmates have taken their personal items? Lucas shrugged, panning his camera across a cell where someone had drawn elaborate murals on every available surface. Bureaucracy, probably. Maybe the transfer was rushed. Maybe this stuff wasn't worth moving. But it didn't feel right. These weren't just random objects left behind. They were arranged, positioned, as if the cells were stage sets waiting for actors to return. A meal tray sat on a bed in one cell, its contents long since rotted into unrecognizable shapes. But the fork and knife were placed neatly beside it, lined up with geometric precision. We moved deeper into the cell block, and I became aware of a sensation I couldn't quite name. Not like being watched exactly, more like being anticipated. As if the building knew we were there and was waiting to see what we would do. 87421. I stopped walking. Did you hear that? I asked Lucas. He was 20 feet ahead, filming a cell with Hebrew text written across its walls. Hear what? Someone said numbers. It's an old building, man. Acoustics are weird, probably just pipes or something. But I knew what I'd heard. A voice, neither male nor female, speaking clearly from somewhere nearby. 5 digits, 87421. My inmate number from the nightmare I'd had 2 nights ago. I hadn't thought about that dream in days, had barely remembered it upon waking. I'd been in a cell, wearing gray prison clothes, counting cracks in the ceiling. Someone outside kept calling for me. 87421, time for count. 87421, report for count. Lucas, I think we should leave. He looked back at me, camera still recording. We just got here. I need at least an hour of footage. 87421, report for count. Louder this time. Close enough that I could hear it clearly wasn't coming from pipes or settling metal. It was coming from the cells themselves, from the darkness beyond the reach of our lights. You didn't hear that? I demanded. Lucas's face, half shadowed by his camera's LED panel, showed concern but not fear. Hear what exactly? The voice, the numbers. I stopped myself. My what? My inmate number from a dream I barely remembered? That was insane. I'd never been in this building, I'd never been arrested. I'd lived an aggressively ordinary life. Maybe we should take a break, Lucas said. You're looking pale. But I was already backing away, back toward the cell block entrance. The corridor behind me seemed longer than it had when we'd entered. The doorway at its end impossibly distant. The cells on either side felt closer than they had been, their open doors like mouths ready to swallow anything that ventured too close. That's when I noticed the discrepancy. I was looking at cell 17, its door hanging open, its interior visible in the splash of my phone's flashlight. A bed, a desk, a toilet. Empty but preserved, like everything else in this place. Then Lucas swept his camera across the same cell, and in his LED panel's glare, I saw something different reflected in his viewfinder screen. The cell door was closed. I looked back at the actual cell. Open. Looked at Lucas's camera screen. Closed. Lucas, point your camera at that cell again. He obliged, panning back. I watched his screen. In the camera's eye, every cell door we'd passed stood shut and locked, their small windows dark. But when I looked with my own eyes, I saw them as they'd been before. Open, inviting, wrong. What am I looking for? Lucas asked. I couldn't answer. My throat had gone tight. 87421, final count. Report to your cell. The voice was coming from cell 17 now. I was certain of it. And though I knew I shouldn't, though every rational part of my brain screamed against it, I found myself walking toward that open door. The cell's interior was identical to all the others we'd passed: concrete walls, metal bed frame with a thin mattress, small desk bolted to the floor, toilet and sink in the corner. But there was something on the desk that made my stomach lurch, a notebook. Open. Filled with handwriting I recognized. My handwriting. I stepped closer, Lucas calling something behind me that I didn't process. The notebook's pages were covered in entries, dated entries, starting from 3 years ago. Journal entries, describing daily routines in exhaustive detail: meals, count times, exercise periods, dreams of life outside, dreams of going home to Millbrook, dreams of parents who'd moved to Florida. My hand shook as I reached for the notebook, but the moment my fingers touched it, it disintegrated. Not slowly, not with theatrical flourish. It simply ceased to exist, dissolving into fine particles that evaporated before hitting the floor. "Whoa," Lucas said from the doorway. "Did you see that? Tell me the camera caught that." But when I turned to look at him, I saw two versions of my friend existing simultaneously. One stood in the doorway, camera raised, face excited. The other stood inside the cell with me. But this Lucas wore a guard's uniform, his face harder, older, his hand resting on a baton at his hip. "Count time, 87421, Guard Lucas said. "You know the drill." I blinked, and he was just Lucas again, my friend, looking concerned and thoroughly freaked out. "I think there might be mold or something in here," he said. "Some kind of toxic spores. We should really go." But I was looking past him now, out into the cell block, and I saw that reality had started to fracture. Some cells showed empty and abandoned. Others showed occupied, shadowy figures visible through their windows, watching us. The concrete floor was clean in places, filthy in others, sometimes both at once, my vision unable to reconcile what it was seeing. The numbers came again, but now they were everywhere, echoing from every direction. 87421, 87421. Dozens of voices, hundreds maybe, all calling the same 5 digits, my digits. The number I'd been assigned in a place I'd never been, serving time for crimes I'd never committed, living years I'd never lived unless I had. The thought came with a wave of dissociation so powerful, I had to grab the cell door frame to stay upright. What if the dream hadn't been a dream? What if everything I remembered, the childhood in Millbrook, the college years, the career, the life, what if all of that was the fiction? What if this place, this cell, this number, were the only real things, and everything else was just an elaborate fantasy constructed by a mind desperate to escape? "We need to leave," Lucas was saying, pulling at my arm. "Right now." But which Lucas? The explorer with the camera, or the guard with the baton? Which version of this reality was real? I let him pull me back into the corridor, back toward the entrance. The cells slid past, and in each one I saw ghosts of possible lives. A version of myself reading on that cot, another version writing letters that would never be sent. A third version staring at walls, counting time in heartbeats and breaths, because there was nothing else left to count. We were almost to the cell block door when I realized Lucas wasn't pulling me toward the exit. He was leading me deeper into the facility, down corridors I didn't remember passing through, past rooms I'd never seen, administrative offices with files spilling from cabinets, a medical bay with gurneys still made up with sheets, a cafeteria where hundreds of trays sat arranged on tables, meals half-eaten, as if an entire population had vanished mid-bite. "Lucas, this is the wrong way." "No, it's not. Trust me." But I didn't. Couldn't. Because I'd just seen my own face reflected in a darkened window, and I was wearing gray clothes with a number stenciled across the chest. 87421. I wrenched my arm free and ran. The corridors twisted around me, branching and reconnecting in impossible configurations. I passed the same guard station 3 times from different angles, crossed through a laundry facility that shouldn't have existed on this floor, found myself in a chapel with rows of empty pews facing an altar decorated with symbols I didn't recognize and couldn't stop looking at. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, multiple sets, boots on concrete, Guard Lucas and others, spreading out, searching. The count wasn't finished. 87421 needed to be accounted for. 87421 needed to return to his cell. I burst through a door and found myself in what must have been the prison's intake area. Processing desks behind bulletproof glass. Metal benches bolted to the floor. A wall covered in mugshots. hundreds of faces staring out with expressions ranging from defiant to broken. And there, in the third row, seventh from the left, was my face. Younger than I was now, maybe by 3 or 4 years, but unmistakably me. The placard beneath held my name, a date from 3 years ago, and the number 87421. My legs went weak. I sat down hard on one of the metal benches, staring at that photograph, trying to make sense of it. This couldn't be real. This was some kind of elaborate prank, or I was having a psychotic break, or the building really was full of toxic mold that was causing hallucinations. But the photograph stared back with eyes that knew things I didn't want to know. There you are. I looked up. Lucas stood in the doorway, but now there were 2 of him again, flickering between versions explorer and guard. Friend and captor. Both and neither. You missed count, he said. That's a write-up. I was never here, I heard myself say. I've never been arrested. I've lived my whole life in Millbrook. I went to college. I have a job. I came back to help my parents move. Your parents moved to Florida 3 years ago, Lucas said. Or maybe it wasn't Lucas anymore. Maybe it had never been Lucas. You got the news right before intake, remember? That's why you were so upset during processing. And God help me, I did remember. The phone call. My mother's voice, apologetic but firm. They'd bought a condo in Tampa. The move was happening whether I could be there or not. They'd leave some boxes at a storage facility, but I'd need to sort through them eventually, figure out what I wanted to keep after I got out. After my sentence. After I served my time for what? What had I done? What crime had brought me here? The accident, Lucas said softly, reading my confusion, on Route 9, the night of the storm. You don't remember? I remembered rain, remembered headlights and twisted metal, remembered sirens and questions I couldn't answer. But that was just another nightmare, wasn't it? Another fiction my sleeping mind had constructed, except which mind was sleeping? The one that remembered freedom and career and life outside these walls? Or the one that knew, with absolute certainty, that I'd never left this building? That I'd been here for 3 years counting days and losing myself in fantasies of what existence might have been like if things had gone differently? Come on, Lucas said, extending a hand. Back to your cell. Maybe tomorrow you'll feel better. Maybe tomorrow you'll remember who you really are. I didn't take his hand. Couldn't. Because if I did, if I followed him back to cell 17 and laid down on that cot and accepted this reality, then I would be admitting that everything else had been a lie. The childhood, the dreams, the person I thought I was. All of it would dissolve like that notebook, leaving only this concrete truth. But if I ran, if I kept refusing, would that make any difference? Would I just find myself back here eventually, back in this cell, back at count time, forever trapped in the loop of my own denial? 87421, a voice announced over an intercom system that had been dead moments before. Report to your cell. Final warning. I stood up, looked at Lucas, or the thing wearing Lucas's face, or the guard who'd always been there, or the friend who'd never existed. Looked at my own photograph on the wall. Looked at the exit doors that led outside, to a parking lot, to a town, to a life that might or might not have been real. And I still don't know which way I walked. I'm sitting in my childhood bedroom right now, writing this down before the details fade. The prison is visible through my window, dark and abandoned. My parents are downstairs, packing boxes for their move next month. Lucas texted me an hour ago, asking if I wanted to explore the old prison tonight. Said he'd heard the security was completely gone, but there's a mark on my wrist that wasn't there yesterday. A faded band where something might have been worn for a very long time. And when I close my eyes, I can hear the counting 87421, 87421, 87421. Sometimes I wonder if I should check the storage facility, see if my parents really did leave boxes there 3 years ago. But I'm afraid of what I might find, or worse, afraid of what I might not find. So I sit here instead, in a room that feels almost real, in a life that feels almost true, waiting for Lucas to text again, waiting for count time. Story 8. The work order said nothing out of the ordinary. Address, complaint about intermittent service, standard rural installation from 3 years back. I'd driven 40 minutes into the kind of nowhere that makes you check your gas gauge twice, where farmland gives way to scrub brush, and the cell towers thin out like they're afraid to go any farther. The property sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud in the places where morning dew hadn't burned off yet. An old farmhouse, 2 stories, white paint gone gray with weather and neglect. Behind it, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, as if the wind had been pushing it in the same direction for decades. The kind of place people inherit and can't afford to maintain, or can't afford to leave. I parked near the porch and waited, engine ticking as it cooled. The protocol was always the same. Knock. Wait. Identify yourself as the technician. But something about the silence out here made me hesitate. No dogs barking, no curtains moving, just the empty windows reflecting clouds and the distant tree line. When I finally stepped out, my boots crunched on gravel and something else. Something that might have been old corn husks scattered across the drive. The air smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, just wrong. Like ozone before a storm. But the sky was clear. I knocked 3 times. The sound seemed to get swallowed by the house rather than echoing inside it. No answer. I knocked again, called out my name and company. Nothing. Standard procedure said to check the external junction box first, so I circled around to where the fiber line came in from the road. That's when I noticed my diagnostic tablet going crazy. Signal strength at 98%. Upload and download, both showing active traffic. Not just a little traffic, the kind of bandwidth usage you'd see from a small office building, not a single rural residence. I pulled up the device list. 43 devices currently connected to the network. 43. Smartphones, tablets, computers, streaming devices, all showing active connections, all pulling data simultaneously. My chest tightened in a way I didn't quite understand yet. Something about those numbers felt invasive, like I'd stumbled onto information I wasn't meant to see. I glanced back at the house, at those dark windows. Were there really 43 people inside? It didn't seem possible. The place looked abandoned. I followed the fiber line where it disappeared into the foundation, near what had to be the basement access. The door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it recently and not bothered to close it all the way. The smart thing would have been to leave right then. Call the office, report possible squatters or something irregular. Let someone else handle it. But I'd been doing this job for 6 years, and in 6 years you develop a kind of professional curiosity that overrides common sense. Besides, the company was strict about completing service calls. Incomplete tickets meant deductions, and I couldn't afford deductions. I pulled the door open. Wooden stairs descended into darkness. The smell hit me immediately. Not decay or mildew, but something sterile antiseptic, like a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, finding each step as I descended. The temperature dropped with each stair, that damp cold that gets into your bones. At the bottom, I swept the light across the space. What I saw made no sense. The basement had been transformed. Not renovated, transformed. The walls were covered in some kind of sound-dampening foam, the industrial kind you'd find in recording studios. The concrete floor had been painted black, clean and unmarked, and arranged in perfect rows, facing away from me toward the far wall, were chairs. 14 chairs, maybe 15. Folding chairs, each one precisely spaced from the next, all of them facing a television mounted on the far wall. An old CRT model, the kind with the curved screen that nobody used anymore. It was dark, powered off, its gray face reflecting my flashlight beam like a dead eye. My tablet vibrated in my hand. I glanced down at the screen and felt something cold slide down my spine. Video calls. Active video calls. 7 of them. all originating from this location. Each one showed the same status. Connection stable. Each one had been running for hours, some for days according to the timestamp. The bandwidth usage was enormous, steady, uninterrupted, but there was nobody here. Just empty chairs and that dead television. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and climb those stairs and get in my truck and drive until the signal bars on my phone disappeared completely. But instead, I walked deeper into the basement, my boots silent on that painted floor. The chairs weren't just arranged randomly. Up close, I could see the precision of it, each one exactly 3 feet from the next, each one angled at the same degree toward the screen. The kind of arrangement that required measurement, planning. Someone had taken time with this. I reached out and touched the back of the nearest chair. The metal was cold, but not the ambient cold of the basement. This was colder, like it had been kept in a freezer. I pulled my hand back and noticed my fingers had left condensation marks on the surface. My tablet vibrated again. Another notification. Another video call connecting. Status: connection stable to other side. Other side of what? I turned back toward the television. In the darkness, with my flashlight beam not quite reaching it, the curved screen seemed less like glass and more like the surface of water. Dark water, deep and still. A sound made me freeze. Soft, barely audible, like static or like breathing. Coming from somewhere behind the television, I moved closer. Flashlight extended like a weapon. Behind the TV, I found the junction box, the main network hub for the entire property. It was an older model, but someone had modified it extensively. Additional cables snaked out from it, disappearing into the walls, the ceiling, places they shouldn't go. Professional work, but wrong somehow. The routing made no technical sense. The static sound grew louder, not coming from the junction box, coming from the television itself. I stood there, flashlight beam fixed on that dark screen, and realized the sound wasn't static at all. It was voices. Multiple voices, talking over each other in a language I couldn't quite distinguish. Not English, not any language I recognized, but almost familiar, like hearing a conversation through water or from the bottom of a well. My tablet showed another call connecting, then another. The active call count climbed to 10, 12, 15, all from this location, all stable, all marked as other side. I reached for the television's power button, my hand shaking now, and something stopped me. Not physically. Nothing touched me. But the overwhelming certainty that turning on that screen would show me something I couldn't unsee. Something that would change the fundamental way I understood the world. The voices grew clearer. Still not words exactly, but inflection tone. The rising and falling cadence of conversation. And underneath it all, a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely. I backed away from the television, and that's when I noticed the other details. Indentations in the black floor, slight impressions in a perfect circle around the chairs, as if something heavy had been standing there recently, observing. The sound-dampening foam on the walls had patterns in it, subtle designs that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. Symbols, maybe, or just the random texture of industrial materials playing tricks on my eyes in the flashlight beam. My tablet showed 20 active calls now, 20 simultaneous video connections from this basement, each one pulling bandwidth, each one marked as stable. I pulled up the call log, scrolling back through days, weeks, hundreds of connections, thousands, all originating from this address, all to the same designation. Other side. The temperature had dropped further. I could see my breath now, white clouds dissipating in the flashlight beam. The voices from the television were louder, more insistent, and I realized with mounting horror that they were all using the same inflection, the same rhythm, speaking in unison, or maybe echoing each other across some impossible distance. I turned to leave, to finally listen to every instinct telling me to run, and saw something that made my legs forget how to work. In the darkness at the top of the stairs, Where the basement door stood open to the daylight above, something was moving. Not a person. Not quite a shape that suggested human form, but didn't commit to it, like watching someone through frosted glass. It remained there, blocking the exit, patient and still. My tablet vibrated continuously now, a steady thrumming against my palm. The screen showed 30 calls, 40, the number climbing faster than should be possible. The bandwidth graph had flatlined at maximum capacity, pulling more data than the connection should physically allow. Behind me, the television clicked on. I didn't turn around. Couldn't turn around. But I could see the light it cast, blue and flickering, reflecting off the black floor, and making the shadows in the basement writhe and dance. The voices stopped their murmuring and fell into perfect silence, and somehow that was worse than any sound. The shape at the top of the stairs resolved slightly, gaining definition. It might have been a person standing in the doorway. It might have been several people, overlapping. The light from above made it impossible to tell where one form ended and another began. My tablet screen went dark, then lit up again, showing a single notification: incoming video call from other side. Below it, 2 options: accept, decline. The cursor blinked, waiting for my input. From behind me came a new sound. Not voices anymore. Something mechanical and organic at once, like gears turning inside something that breathed. The television's light grew brighter, casting my shadow long and distorted across the floor toward the stairs. I thought about my truck parked outside, about the 40-minute drive back to civilization, about the work order in my pocket that listed this address, this service call, my name as the assigned technician. Had someone requested this specifically? Had someone known I would come? The shape at the stairs moved slightly, and I saw, or thought I saw, other shapes behind it, filling the stairwell, crowding the door, all of them perfectly still, watching with whatever they had instead of eyes. My finger hovered over the tablet screen. Accept or decline. The cursor blinked patiently, and I understood with absolute certainty that whatever choice I made, I wouldn't be leaving this basement the same way I'd entered it. The television light flickered in a pattern that felt deliberate. 3 short pulses. 3 long. 3 short. The universal signal for distress, except reversed. Not a call for help. An answer to one. I pressed my thumb against the screen. The call connected. The television's reflection in the black floor showed something that wasn't in the room with me. Or maybe it was, and I simply hadn't seen it until the screen gave it permission to be seen. Figures in the chairs now, sitting perfectly straight, all of them facing the screen with attention that felt hungry. They hadn't been there a moment ago. They were absolutely there now. The video call window opened on my tablet, and I made the mistake of looking down at it. On the screen, I saw the basement from a different angle, saw the television, saw the chairs and the figures sitting in them, saw myself, standing in the center of it all, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. But I also saw something else. Saw myself from dozens of other angles simultaneously, as if the room were full of cameras or eyes, all focused on the same point. The call counter on my tablet rolled over. 99 active connections. Then 3 digits turned to 4, and 4 to 5, and the number climbed so fast it became a blur. From the television came a voice, clear and close and terribly familiar. My own voice, but wrong. The timing off, the emphasis strained.